The frozen body lay face down in the cabin doorway, one arm stretched toward the snow, as if reaching for help that never came. 10-year-old Clara Hale knelt beside her mother's stiffening corpse, her bare knees pressed against the icy floorboards, while 8-year-old Lucy sobbed into her sister's shoulder. The winter wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, and Clara knew with terrible certainty that if they stayed here another night, they would freeze to death beside their mother. She lifted her eyes to the window where a thin ribbon of smoke rose from somewhere beyond the white horizon, the only sign of life in a world that had gone silent and cold. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice cracking, "we have to go." If you want to see how far this story of survival and unexpected family travels, drop a comment below with your city and hit that like button. Now let me take you back to that brutal morning when two little girls walked into the unknown, searching for something they didn't even know existed. Home. The sun hadn't fully risen when Clara realized her mother wasn't breathing. She'd woken to silence, the kind that settles over a place when something vital has stopped. No coughing, no labored breathing. Just the whistle of wind through the cabin's rotting timber and the creak of frozen branches outside. Clara sat up on the thin straw mattress she shared with Lucy, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Across the single room, her mother lay motionless on the only real bed they owned, her face turned toward the wall. "Mama?" Clara's voice came out small, almost swallowed by the emptiness. Nothing. She slipped from beneath the threadbare quilt, careful not to wake Lucy, and crossed the cabin floor. Each footstep cracked against the ice that had formed overnight where their breath had condensed and frozen. The cabin was barely larger than a horse stall, with gaps between the wall boards wide enough to see daylight. "Mama, it's morning." Clara touched her mother's shoulder. The fabric of her nightdress was stiff with cold, and beneath it her mother's body had the stillness of stone. Clara jerked her hand back. She stood there for a long moment, her mind refusing to accept what her body already knew. Then she heard Lucy stirring behind her. "Clara? Is Mama sick again?" Clara turned. Lucy sat up in the tangle of quilts, her dark hair matted against her pale face, her eyes still heavy with sleep. At 8 years old, she looked even younger, small and fragile, like something that might break if the wind blew too hard. "Stay there," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "But I'm cold. I said stay there." Lucy's face crumpled, and Clara immediately felt the guilt settle over her shoulders like another weight. She crossed back to the bed and sat down, pulling Lucy close. "I'm sorry," she whispered into her sister's hair. "I'm sorry, Lou." "What's wrong with Mama?" Clara closed her eyes. She wanted to lie. She wanted to tell Lucy that Mama was just sleeping, that she'd wake up soon and make them cornmeal mush and tell them stories about when they lived in Ohio before Papa died. But lies wouldn't keep them alive. "She's gone," Clara said quietly. Lucy pulled back, searching her sister's face. "Gone where?" "Just gone." Understanding came slowly, settling over Lucy's features like frost forming on glass. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks in silent streams. Clara held her while she cried, staring over her sister's head at their mother's body. Margaret Hale had been 32 years old. She'd buried a husband, lost 2 babies before they could walk, and dragged her surviving daughters west with promises of a fresh start. Instead, she'd found a leaking cabin on the edge of nowhere, winter that came early and stayed late, and a sickness that settled in her lungs and never left. Now she was just another person who hadn't made it through the cold. "What do we do?" Lucy whispered. Clara didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the neighbors, if you could call them that. The Hendersons lived 2 miles east, but they'd made it clear they had no charity to spare for a widow and her children. The Pratts were even farther, and they'd lost half their own kids to scarlet fever last summer. Nobody in these parts had room for 2 more mouths to feed. Her eyes drifted to the window where weak morning light filtered through the dirty glass. And there it was, that thin column of smoke rising in the distance, maybe 3 miles north. She'd seen it before, when she climbed the ridge to gather what firewood she could find. Someone lived out there, someone with enough wood to keep a fire burning. "We can't stay here," Clara said finally. Lucy pulled back, her face blotchy with tears. "But Mama's dead, Lou." The words came out harder than Clara meant them to. She softened her voice. "We can't bury her. The ground's frozen solid, And if we stay here, we'll freeze too. Where will we go? Clara pointed to the window. There's smoke out there. Someone's got a fire going. Maybe they'll help us. What if they won't? Then we'll figure something else out. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Lucy nodded anyway, because what choice did she have? She was 8 years old, and Clara was the only family she had left. They dressed in every piece of clothing they owned, 2 dresses each, stockings with holes in them, coats that had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Clara wrapped Lucy's feet in strips of cloth before putting on her boots, knowing the leather had cracked and wouldn't keep out the wet. She left their mother a note, even though there was no one to read it. She didn't know what else to do. Mama, we had to go. I'm sorry we can't bury you proper. I love you. Clara. She weighed the paper down with a stone and didn't look back. The prairie in winter was a study in bleakness. Snow stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional skeleton of sagebrush or the dark slash of a frozen creek bed. The wind came from the north, constant and cutting, carrying ice crystals that stung their faces like thrown sand. Clara kept Lucy close, one arm around her sister's shoulders. They followed the smoke, but the distance was deceptive. What looked like 3 miles turned into 4, then 5. The sun climbed higher, but gave no warmth. Their feet went numb inside their boots. Lucy stumbled twice in the first hour. The third time she went down hard, her hands disappearing into a snowdrift. Get up, Clara said, pulling at her arm. I can't. Lucy's voice was muffled by the wind. I'm too tired. You have to. I want Mama. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow and grabbed Lucy's face between her frozen hands. Mama's gone. It's just us now, and I'm not going to let you die out here, you understand me? You're getting up, and you're going to walk, because that's what we do. We keep going. Lucy stared at her with red-rimmed eyes. Then she nodded. They walked. The sun reached its peak and began its descent. The smoke never seemed to get closer. Clara's mind began to play tricks on her. She saw shapes in the distance that weren't there, heard voices on the wind that were only howling air. Her fingers had stopped hurting, which she knew was a bad sign. Clara. Lucy's voice was barely audible. I don't think I can… Look, Clara interrupted, pointing. Ahead, maybe a quarter mile, a structure emerged from the white landscape. Not a house, a barn. Large and dark against the snow, with that blessed smoke rising from somewhere beyond it. We're almost there, Clara said, though she could barely feel her lips moving. Just a little farther. They reached the barn as the sun touched the horizon, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The building was bigger than Clara had expected, well built with proper timber and a roof that didn't sag. Cattle lowed somewhere inside, and the smell of hay and animal warmth drifted through the gaps in the boards. Clara found a side door, half buried in a snowdrift. She pulled at it with hands that barely functioned, and it finally gave way with a groan of frozen hinges. Heat rolled out. Not much, but enough. The warmth of living things and their breath, the insulation of hay and bodies pressed close. Inside, Clara whispered, and they stumbled through. The barn's interior was dim, lit only by the fading light through cracks in the walls. A dozen cattle occupied stalls along one side, their dark eyes watching with mild curiosity. Hay was stacked in tall bales at the far end, and above, a loft promised shelter from the wind. Clara led Lucy to a corner near the hay, where the heat from the cattle gathered. They collapsed together, and for the first time in hours, Clara felt something other than cold. Her body began to shake violently as circulation returned, and beside her, Lucy trembled so hard her teeth rattled. We made it, Clara whispered. We're okay. The barn door swung open. A man stood silhouetted against the dying light, broad-shouldered and tall, carrying a lantern that cast his face in shadow. He didn't move for a long moment, just stood there looking at them. Clara's arms tightened around Lucy. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat had frozen shut. The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He hung the lantern on a hook, and in its light, Clara could finally see him clearly. He was maybe 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that had gone untrimmed for weeks. His face was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, lined at the corners of his eyes and mouth. He wore work clothes, wool shirt, canvas pants, boots caked with manure and mud, and moved with the careful economy of someone used to being alone. His eyes settled on them without surprise, as if he found frozen children in his barn every evening. "How long you been here?" His voice was rough from disuse. Clara tried to answer, but only a small sound came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. Just now. We just got here." "Where'd you come from?" "South?" Clara's voice grew stronger. "Our cabin. 5, maybe 6 miles." The man's gaze moved over them, taking in their inadequate clothing, their blue-tinged lips, the way they couldn't stop shaking. "Where's your folks?" Clara felt Lucy press closer against her side. "Our mama died this morning. Our papa's been dead 2 years. Other family?" "No, sir, just us." The man was quiet for a moment, studying them with an expression Clara couldn't read. Then he nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Can you walk?" "Yes, sir." "Then follow me." He turned and headed for the door without waiting to see if they'd obey. Clara and Lucy exchanged a glance, then struggled to their feet. Their legs barely worked, stiff with cold and exhaustion, but they managed to stumble after him. Outside, full dark had fallen. The man led them across a yard where snow had been trampled by boots and hooves. Ahead, a house emerged from the darkness, larger than Clara had expected. 2 stories with a stone chimney from which that blessed smoke rose into the night sky. The man opened the front door and gestured them inside. Heat hit Clara like a physical thing. A fire burned in a massive stone fireplace, filling the room with light and warmth that seemed almost painful after hours in the cold. She stood in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid this was a dream that would shatter if she stepped forward. "In or out," the man said. "But close the door." They went in. The house was sparsely furnished but clean. A table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves holding books, and simple dishware. Stairs led up to a second floor, and doors opened to what Clara guessed were a kitchen and bedroom. It was the kind of house that could hold a family, but everything about it suggested only one person lived here. The man moved to the fireplace and added another log. Then he pulled the rocking chair closer to the fire and pointed at it. "Sit there, both of you." Clara and Lucy sat pressed together in the chair meant for one. The heat from the fire was almost unbearable at first, making their frozen skin burn as feeling returned. Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out. The man disappeared into the kitchen. They heard the clank of pots, the sound of water being poured. When he returned, he carried 2 tin cups of something that steamed in the firelight. "Drink this, slow." Clara took the cups and handed one to Lucy. The liquid was broth, thin but hot, with the taste of beef and salt. It burned going down, but it was the most wonderful thing Clara had ever tasted. They drank in silence while the man watched from across the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He didn't ask questions, didn't make small talk, just watched them with those careful, measuring eyes. When they'd finished, he took the cups back and disappeared again into the kitchen. This time, he returned with a plate holding thick slices of bread and butter. "Eat what you can. Don't make yourself sick." Clara wanted to devour everything, but she forced herself to eat slowly, taking small bites and making Lucy do the same. Her stomach, shrunken from months of too little food, couldn't handle much. When they'd eaten half the bread, the man nodded and took the plate away. He returned with blankets, thick wool, smelling of cedar and smoke. "You can sleep by the fire tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do with you." It wasn't an offer of permanence. It wasn't even particularly kind in its delivery, but it was shelter and warmth and food, which was more than they'd had that morning. "Thank you," Clara whispered. The man paused on his way to the stairs. He looked back at them, these 2 small girls wrapped in blankets by his fire, and something shifted in his expression, gone too quickly for Clara to identify. "Name's Ethan Carter," he said. "This is my ranch, my rules. You do what I tell you, when I tell you. Understood?" "Yes, sir." He nodded and climbed the stairs, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. A door closed above, and then there was only the sound of the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. Clara held Lucy close, feeling her sister's breathing slow and deepen as exhaustion finally claimed her. She stared into the flames, her mind trying to process everything that had happened since dawn. Her mother's death, The desperate walk across the frozen prairie, this strange, silent man who'd taken them in without question. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if Ethan Carter would send them away or keep them or hand them over to whoever was supposed to deal with orphaned children on the frontier. But tonight, they were warm. Tonight, they were alive. And for now, that was enough. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was home. Real home back in Ohio when Papa was still alive and Mama laughed instead of coughed. Then she opened her eyes and saw the unfamiliar ceiling, the massive stone fireplace where a fresh fire burned, and remembered. Lucy still slept beside her, curled into a tight ball beneath the blankets. Clara carefully extracted herself and stood, her body aching from yesterday's ordeal. Through the window, she could see pale dawn light spreading across the snow. Ethan Carter stood at the stove in the kitchen doorway, his back to her. He wore the same clothes as yesterday, and his movements had the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for himself for a long time. Clara cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter?" He glanced over his shoulder. "You're up." "Yes, sir. Is there something I can do to help?" "Sit down. Food's almost ready." Clara hesitated, then moved to the table. It had been set with 3 plates, 3 cups, 3 sets of utensils. The sight of it made something catch in her throat. This simple acknowledgement that they existed, that they warranted a place at his table. Ethan brought over a pan and distributed bacon and eggs onto the plates. The portions were generous, more food than Clara and Lucy usually saw in 2 days. He poured coffee for himself, milk for them, and sat down without ceremony. "Eat," he said. Clara wanted to wake Lucy, but the smell of food did that job for her. Her sister sat up slowly, blinking in confusion at her surroundings. Then she saw the table and scrambled over so fast she nearly tripped on the blankets. They ate in silence. Ethan didn't make conversation, and Clara was too busy trying not to eat so fast she made herself sick. The food was simple but prepared with care. The bacon crisp, the eggs seasoned with salt and pepper, the coffee strong and dark. When they'd finished, Ethan collected the plates and set them in a basin by the stove. Then he turned to face them, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "So," he said, "your mama died yesterday morning." "Yes, sir," Clara replied. "And your cabin is 5-6 miles south of here." "Yes, sir." "Anyone know she's dead? Anyone coming to check on you?" Clara shook her head. "No, sir. We didn't have many neighbors. The ones we had didn't much like us." Ethan studied them for a moment. "Why not?" Clara hesitated. It was a shameful thing, but he'd asked. "Mama was a widow. Some people thought that meant she was improper, and we didn't have money for church donations or social calls. So nobody's going to come looking for you." "No, sir." Ethan was quiet, his expression unreadable. Clara felt her heart start to pound. This was it, the moment where he'd tell them they had to leave, that he couldn't keep them, that they needed to go to the town orphanage or find some distant relative who didn't exist. Instead, he pushed off from the counter and grabbed his coat from a hook by the door. "I've got cattle to feed," he said. "You two stay inside, keep the fire going, don't touch anything you don't understand." He was out the door before Clara could respond, letting in a blast of cold air that made Lucy shiver. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to his boots crunch through the snow as he headed toward the barn. "What do you think he's going to do with us?" Lucy whispered. Clara had no idea, but she remembered the 3 plates on the table, the blankets he'd given them, the way he'd said, "Don't touch anything," instead of "You're leaving." "I don't know," she said honestly, "but for now, we do what he said. We stay inside and keep the fire going." The day passed slowly. Clara and Lucy stayed close to the fire, still wearing their layers of clothing even in the warmth of the house. Clara explored carefully, trying to understand the man who lived here. The main room held little in the way of decoration, no pictures on the walls, no knickknacks on the shelves, just books, mostly. Agricultural manuals, a few novels with cracked spines, a Bible that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The kitchen was similarly sparse but well organized. Everything had its place, and everything was clean. Clara noticed a second set of dishes pushed to the back of a shelf. Finer plates with a delicate pattern, cups with painted flowers. Wedding china, maybe. Or a reminder of someone who used to live here. Upstairs, Clara found 3 bedrooms. The first was clearly Ethan's, a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, boots lined up against the wall. The second was completely empty except for dust. The third held a small bed, a child's bed, and a rocking chair in the corner. The bed was neatly made, and on the windowsill sat a carved wooden horse, about the size of Clara's palm. She backed out of that room quickly, pulling the door shut behind her. Ethan returned at midday with an armful of firewood. He said nothing, just stacked it by the hearth and went back out. He came in again at dusk, stamping snow from his boots, and started preparing supper. Stew this time, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of beef. They ate together again in silence. But this time, Clara noticed Lucy watching Ethan with less fear and more curiosity. When he caught her staring, Lucy quickly looked away, but not before Clara saw the ghost of a smile on Ethan's weathered face. After supper, Ethan pulled the rocking chair closer to the fire and sat down with a book. Clara expected him to send them to bed, but he didn't. So they stayed where they were, wrapped in blankets on the floor, watching the flames dance. "Mr. Carter?" Clara said finally, unable to stand the silence any longer. "What? Are you going to send us away?" He looked up from his book, his eyes reflecting the firelight. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he marked his place with a finger and said, "Where would I send you?" "The orphanage, in town." "You ever been to the orphanage in town?" "No, sir." "Then you don't know what it's like there." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. 40 kids in a building made for 20. Not enough food, not enough heat. Kids get sick, they usually don't get better. Clara's throat tightened. "So you're not sending us there?" "Didn't say that either." "Then what?" "I'm saying I haven't decided yet." He opened his book again. "Now be quiet. I'm reading." Clara wanted to press him, wanted to demand an answer, wanted to know if they'd be here tomorrow or out in the cold. But something in his tone told her she'd get nothing more tonight. So she settled back against Lucy and watched the fire burn low, trying not to think about orphanages or frozen cabins or the mother they'd left behind, trying not to think about anything at all. 3 days passed. Ethan didn't send them away. He didn't officially invite them to stay either. He simply continued his routine, rising before dawn, feeding the cattle, returning for meals that he cooked and shared without comment, spending his evenings reading by the fire while Clara and Lucy sat quietly nearby. It was a strange, suspended existence. Clara kept waiting for the other boot to drop, for Ethan to announce that he'd made arrangements, that someone was coming to collect them. But each morning came with nothing more than breakfast and Ethan's terse instructions to stay inside and keep warm. On the 4th day, he came in from the barn carrying something wrapped in canvas. He set it on the table and looked at Clara. "Your feet still cold at night?" Clara blinked, surprised by the direct question. "Sometimes, sir." He unwrapped the canvas, revealing 2 pairs of thick wool socks. "Found these in the storage room. They'll be too big, but better than what you've got." He left them on the table and went back outside. Lucy picked up one of the socks, her eyes wide. "Clara, these are new." They weren't, exactly, but they were clean and intact, with no holes or patches. Clara touched them carefully, as if they might disappear. That night, wearing the warm socks, Lucy slept without shivering for the first time since they'd arrived. On the 7th day, Clara woke to find Ethan standing over them, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Get up," he said. "You're coming with me." Clara's heart jumped into her throat. This was it. He was taking them to town, to the orphanage, or wherever else unwanted children went. "Mr. Carter, move. I've got work to do." They dressed quickly and followed him outside. The sun was just rising, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Ethan led them to the barn, where he handed Clara a bucket. "You ever milk a cow?" Clara shook her head. "Time to learn." He showed her how to approach the cow, how to sit on the stool, how to work the teats with a steady rhythm. Clara's hands were clumsy at first, but gradually she found the motion. Warm milk hissed into the bucket, and she felt a small surge of pride. Ethan watched without comment, then turned to Lucy. "You see those chickens over there?" Lucy nodded nervously. "They need feeding. Come on." Clara finished milking while Ethan showed Lucy how to scatter grain for the chickens, how to collect eggs without breaking them. When they were done, he handed them both tools, a pitchfork for Clara, a smaller rake for Lucy. Mucking stalls, he said. I'll show you once. Then you'll do it every morning. It was hard, dirty work. Clara's arms ached within minutes, and Lucy struggled with the heavy rake. But Ethan worked alongside them, his movement steady and sure, and somehow that made it easier. When they finished, he led them back to the house and started breakfast. You'll earn your keep here, he said as he cooked. I don't keep idle hands. Understand? Yes, sir, Clara said, and the relief that flooded through her was so strong she thought she might cry. Because people didn't teach you to do chores if they were planning to send you away tomorrow. People didn't teach you anything unless they expected you to be around long enough to use it. Winter deepened, and Clara and Lucy fell into the rhythm of ranch life. They rose with the sun, dressed in the warmest clothes Ethan had found for them in storage, and went out to help with morning chores. Clara learned to milk 3 cows in the time it used to take her to milk 1. Lucy got faster at collecting eggs and scattering grain, and she stopped flinching when the rooster came near. Ethan remained a man of few words, but Clara began to understand his silences. There was the silence that meant he was thinking, working through a problem in his head. The silence that meant he was listening, paying attention to the cattle or the weather or the creak of a barn board that might need replacing. And the silence that meant he simply had nothing to say, the most common kind, the silence of a man who'd spent too many years alone. But he taught them how to split firewood, how to recognize when a cow was getting sick, how to mend a fence rail and patch a roof leak. He showed Lucy how to work the water pump without getting soaked, and he taught Clara how to read the sky for coming weather. See those clouds? He said one morning, pointing to a bank of gray on the horizon. They're moving fast, and the air smells like iron. Storm coming. We need to get the cattle in before it hits. They worked together to herd the cattle into the barn, and sure enough, by afternoon the storm rolled in with wind that bent trees and snow that fell so thick Clara couldn't see the house from the barn door. They huddled inside while the blizzard raged, and Ethan made stew on the fireplace since going out to the kitchen seemed foolish. They ate straight from the pot, passing it between them, and for the first time Clara saw Ethan smile. Just a little, just for a moment, when Lucy got stew on her nose and tried to lick it off. Gradually the house began to change. Small things at first. Lucy found a piece of charcoal and started drawing on scraps of paper Ethan gave her, pictures of chickens and cows and the barn. Ethan pinned them to the wall near the fireplace without comment. Clara started humming while she worked, old songs her mother used to sing. She didn't realize she was doing it until she caught Ethan watching her with an odd expression, something between pain and wonder. "Your mama teach you that song?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded and went back to his work. But later that evening, Clara heard him humming it too, quiet and off-key, but unmistakable. The biggest change came when Ethan brought down a trunk from the empty bedroom. Inside were clothes. Women's clothes in styles from years past, and smaller clothes that might have fit a child of 5 or 6. "These were my wife's," he said gruffly, "and my daughter's. They're just taking up space. You might as well use them." Clara stared at the contents of the trunk, understanding settling over her like a weight. The empty bedroom, the child's bed with the carved horse, the wedding china pushed to the back of the shelf. Ethan had lost a family, just like they had. "Thank you," Clara whispered. That night, wearing a nightgown that had belonged to Ethan's wife, Lucy asked the question Clara had been afraid to voice. "Do you think we can stay? Really stay?" Clara smoothed her sister's hair, staring into the dying fire. "I don't know. Maybe. I like it here," Lucy said softly. "Is that okay? Even though Mama's gone?" Clara's throat tightened. "Yeah, Lou. That's okay." "Do you think he likes us?" Clara thought about the socks Ethan had given them, the clothes from his dead family, the way he'd taught them to work instead of sending them away, the way he'd started setting 3 plates on the table without being asked. "I think maybe he does," Clara said. "In his way." Lucy snuggled closer. "I hope we can stay forever." Forever was a long time. Too long to promise, too dangerous to hope for. But as Clara drifted toward sleep, warm and fed and safe, she let herself imagine it, just for a moment, a forever where this was home. The first time someone from town came to the ranch, Clara knew immediately that trouble had followed. It was a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after they'd arrived. Clara was in the barn helping Ethan repair a broken stall gate when Lucy ran in, her face pale. "Clara, there's a wagon coming." Ethan straightened, his expression darkening. "How many people?" "2 men. They're wearing nice clothes." Ethan set down his tools and headed for the barn door, Clara close behind him. Sure enough, a wagon rolled across the snow toward the house, pulled by 2 horses that looked too fine for ranch work. The men climbing down were equally out of place, townsmen in their Sunday best with clean hands and indoor pallor. One was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a walking stick he didn't seem to need. The other was younger, thin and nervous, carrying a leather satchel. "Mr. Carter," the older man called out. "A word, if you please." Ethan walked towards them with slow, deliberate steps. Clara grabbed Lucy's hand and followed, dread settling in her stomach. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Councilman George Preston. This is Mr. Harold Webb, our town clerk. We've heard some interesting news about your household situation." "That's so," Ethan said flatly. "Indeed. Word is you've taken in 2 young girls. Orphans, I'm told." "You heard right." Preston's smile widened. "Well, now, that's quite charitable of you, but you must understand there are proper channels for these things. The welfare of children is a serious matter." "They're fed and sheltered," Ethan said. "Better than they'd be in your orphanage." "Perhaps. But propriety matters, Mr. Carter. A single man living alone with 2 young girls who are no relation to him? I'm sure you can see how that appears." Clara felt Lucy press against her side. She wanted to speak up, to tell these men that Ethan had saved their lives, that he'd given them more kindness in 6 weeks than anyone else had in years. But she held her tongue, knowing instinctively that it would only make things worse. Ethan's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Preston?" "Simply to ensure everything is above board. Mr. Webb here needs to document the situation. After that, the council will need to review the arrangement and determine what's best for all parties involved." "Best for all parties," Ethan repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You mean best for you?" "I mean best for these children." Preston's voice hardened. "Unless you have legal guardianship, which I know you don't, these girls are wards of the territory. We have a responsibility to see they're properly cared for." "They are properly cared for." "By your standards, perhaps, but the law requires more than that." The clerk, Webb, stepped forward nervously. "If you could just answer a few questions, Mr. Carter, we can—" "No," Ethan said. Preston's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. This is my property. You're not welcome here. Leave." "Mr. Carter, I don't think you understand." "I understand fine. You've got nothing better to do than harass a man trying to help 2 kids who'd freeze to death otherwise. Now get off my land before I help you off it." Preston's face flushed red. "This isn't over, Carter. The council will hear about this obstruction. And when they do, those girls will be removed from your care for their own protection. Let them try." The 2 men climbed back into their wagon, Preston's face tight with anger. As they drove away, Clara heard him say to Webb, "Document this. All of it. The council will want a full report." When the wagon disappeared over the ridge, Ethan stood silent for a long moment, staring after it. "Mr. Carter?" Clara said quietly. "What's going to happen?" He looked down at her, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but close to it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But whatever it is, it won't be good." He turned and walked back to the barn, leaving Clara and Lucy standing in the snow, the first real crack appearing in the fragile security they'd built. The warmth they'd found was under threat, and this time there might not be anywhere to run. Window, she could see light in the barn. A window, she could see light in the barn, a single lantern burning in the darkness. She'd seen him walk out there hours ago, his shoulders rigid with tension, and he hadn't returned. Lucy sat at the table, picking at a piece of bread. "Is he mad at us?" "No," Clara said, though she wasn't entirely sure. "He's just thinking." "About what those men said?" Clara nodded. She ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table, but her own appetite had vanished. Preston's words kept echoing in her mind. "Those girls will be removed from your care." She'd heard stories about the orphanage, whispers from other children back when they'd lived near town. Crowded rooms, thin blankets, kids who coughed through the night, and sometimes didn't wake up in the morning. "I don't want to go to the orphanage," Lucy whispered. "We're not going anywhere." "But what if they make us?" Clara had no answer for that, so she did what she'd been doing since their mother died. She pretended to have more confidence than she felt. "Eat your supper," she said firmly. "Everything's going to be fine." But as the night deepened and Ethan still didn't return, Clara's certainty began to crack. She put Lucy to bed by the fire, then wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped outside. The cold hit her like a slap, but she kept walking, her boots crunching through the frozen snow. The barn door stood slightly ajar, lantern light spilling out in a thin yellow line. Clara pushed it open carefully. Ethan sat on a hay bale near the back, the lantern hanging from a beam above him. He wasn't doing anything, not working, not reading, just sitting there with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at nothing. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up, and Clara saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not anger, something worse, something that looked like defeat. "You should be inside," he said. "I brought you supper." She held up the bowl she'd carried, still faintly warm beneath the cloth covering it. "Not hungry." Clara didn't move. "You haven't eaten all day." "I said I'm not hungry." They stared at each other across the dim space. Then Clara set the bowl down on a nearby barrel and sat on the hay bale across from him, uninvited. "Lucy's scared," she said quietly. "She should be." "Are they really going to take us away?" Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back against the barn wall, his face half shadowed by the lantern light. "Preston's got influence," he said finally. "He's on the town council, owns the general store, sits on the church board. If he decides you two are a problem, he can make things difficult." "Why does he care? We're not bothering anyone." "You're bothering him." Ethan's voice was bitter. "Preston and his friends, they don't like things that don't fit into their neat little boxes. A widow woman living alone was bad enough. But 2 orphan girls living with a single man who's not their kin. That's scandal material. Makes them feel like they need to do something. Even if doing something means sending us somewhere worse? Especially then. Makes them feel righteous about it." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping through her shawl. "So what do we do?" "I don't know." The admission hung in the air between them. Clara had gotten used to Ethan's certainty, his quiet competence. Seeing him lost was somehow more frightening than anything Preston had said. "I could tell them we're family," Clara offered. "I could say you're our uncle, or they'd check, and when they found out you lied, they'd use it against us." "Then what? We just wait for them to come take us?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" He looked at her directly, and Clara saw the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to help fighting against the part that knew better than to hope. "I'm saying I don't have an answer yet," he said quietly. "And I'm saying that maybe you'd be safer if I hadn't found you in my barn that night." Clara felt something hot and angry flare in her chest. "That's not true." "You don't know. I know we'd be dead." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I know we were freezing to death, and you gave us food and warmth and a place to sleep. I know you taught us how to work, how to take care of ourselves. I know that for the first time since Papa died," Lucy smiles again. "So don't you dare say we'd be better off somewhere else." Ethan stared at her, something like surprise crossing his weathered features. Then he looked away, his throat working. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "Who?" "My wife, Sarah." He paused. She had that same fire in her, that same stubbornness when she thought something was wrong. It was the first time he'd spoken her name aloud. Clara held very still, afraid that if she moved or spoke, he'd stop talking. "She died 5 years ago," Ethan continued, his voice rough. "Her and our daughter, Emma. There was a fever that winter. Took half the town's children. Emma got it first, then Sarah caught it taking care of her. They both went within a week." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "After that, I figured I was done. Done with people, done with caring about anything except keeping the ranch running. I sold off half the herd, sent the hired men away, and just stopped. Stopped going to town, stopped talking to neighbors, stopped doing anything that wasn't absolutely necessary." He looked at her again. "Then you and your sister showed up in my barn, half frozen and desperate, and I couldn't let you die." Why not? Clara asked softly. If you were done with people, why help us? Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because Sarah would have skinned me alive if I'd turned away 2 kids who needed help. And because... He stopped, struggling with the words. Because maybe I wasn't as done as I thought I was. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. We don't want to be anywhere else, she said. Lucy and me. We want to stay here. With you. I know. Ethan's voice was heavy. But wanting something doesn't make it possible. Then we'll make it possible. How? Clara didn't have an answer for that either, but she thought about everything Ethan had taught them. How to work, how to survive, how to face problems head on instead of running from them. We'll find a way, she said with more confidence than she felt. We have to. Ethan studied her for a moment, then reached for the bowl she'd brought. He pulled off the cloth and ate slowly, mechanically, like a man going through the motions of living without really feeling it. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and stood. It's late. Get back inside before you freeze. Clara rose too, but didn't move toward the door. Mr. Carter, thank you for everything. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up the lantern and followed her back to the house. That night, lying beside Lucy in front of the dying fire, Clara made a decision. She didn't know how yet, but she would find a way to stay. They both would. Because this ranch, this quiet man with his terrible grief and his careful kindness, had become something neither of them could afford to lose. It had become home. The next morning brought visitors of a different kind. Clara was collecting eggs when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart jumped into her throat. Preston, coming back already. But when she looked out the barn door, she saw 3 women climbing down from a wagon. They wore respectable dresses and bonnets, and they moved with the purposeful efficiency of people on a mission. Ethan emerged from the house, his expression immediately guarded. Clara abandoned the egg basket and hurried over with Lucy close behind. The oldest of the 3 women stepped forward. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it didn't smile often. Mr. Carter, I'm Mrs. Dorothy Simmons. This is Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Worth. We're from the Ladies' Benevolent Society. I know who you are, Ethan said flatly. Then you know we take an interest in the welfare of children in our community. Mrs. Simmons' gaze shifted to Clara and Lucy, her eyes sharp and assessing. These must be the orphans we've heard about. They have names, Ethan said. Clara and Lucy Hale. Of course. Mrs. Simmons' tone suggested she didn't particularly care. We've come to assess their living situation. I'm sure you understand, as concerned citizens, we have a responsibility to ensure these children are being properly cared for. They're fine. Nevertheless, we'd like to see for ourselves. It wasn't a request. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. The 3 women swept past him into the house, their skirts rustling with disapproval before they'd even crossed the threshold. Clara and Lucy followed, watching as the women examined everything with critical eyes. Mrs. Simmons inspected the dishes, the bedding by the fire, the cleanliness of the floor. Mrs. Fletcher opened cupboards and peered into corners. Mrs. Worth examined Clara and Lucy themselves like they were livestock at auction. Their clothes are quite worn, Mrs. Worth observed. They're warm, Ethan said tersely. And they sleep here? On the floor? Mrs. Simmons gestured to the makeshift bed by the fireplace. By the fire, where it's warmest. Most irregular, Mrs. Fletcher sniffed. Young girls should have proper beds. A proper room. There's a room upstairs, Ethan said. They prefer to sleep down here. It wasn't entirely true. They'd never been offered the choice. But Clara understood what he was doing. Defending them. Defending the arrangement. Mrs. Simmons turned to Clara with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tell me, child, how are you being treated here? Clara felt Lucy press against her side. She knew what the woman wanted to hear, some complaint, some evidence of impropriety or neglect that would justify removing them. Mr. Carter has been very kind to us, Clara said carefully. He feeds us and keeps us warm and teaches us how to help with the ranch work. He makes you work? Mrs. Worth's eyebrows rose. At your age? We want to help, Lucy piped up. Clara milks the cows and I feed the chickens. How rustic. Mrs. Fletcher exchanged a look with the other women. Mrs. Simmons clasped her hands together. Mr. Carter, I'm sure your intentions are good, but you must see that this situation is highly unusual. A single man living alone with two young girls who are not his relations, it simply isn't proper. Proper doesn't keep them alive, Ethan said coldly. The orphanage does a poor job of that. The orphanage provides structure, education, and moral guidance. The orphanage is overcrowded and underfunded, and half the kids who go in don't come out. Ethan's voice was hard as stone. These two are healthy, fed, and learning useful skills. That's more than you can say for the children in your care. Mrs. Simmons' face flushed. Mr. Carter, I'll thank you not to. You've seen what you came to see. Now leave. The women drew themselves up with collective indignation. Mrs. Simmons' eyes glittered with barely suppressed anger. Very well, but I assure you the Benevolent Society will be making a full report to Councilman Preston and the town authorities. This matter is far from resolved. They swept out as dramatically as they'd entered, their disapproval hanging in the air like smoke. Clara watched through the window as they climbed into their wagon, already talking among themselves in urgent whispers. When they'd gone, Ethan stood motionless in the center of the room, his hands clenched into fists. They're going to take us away, aren't they? Lucy's voice was small and frightened. Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he crossed to the fireplace and jabbed at the logs with more force than necessary. Not if I can help it, he said finally. But Clara heard the doubt beneath his words. And she knew that wanting to help and being able to help were two very different things. The town's campaign against them intensified over the following weeks. First came the subtle pressure. Shopkeepers who suddenly couldn't extend credit. Neighbors who stopped returning greetings. The minister who paid a visit to suggest that Ethan might want to reconsider his living arrangements for the sake of his soul. Ethan ignored it all with the same grim determination he brought to every task. But Clara could see it wearing on him. The lines around his eyes deepened. He slept less, worked more, and the silences between them grew heavier. Then the official notices began arriving. Letters from the territorial government demanding documentation of the girl's status. Summons to appear before various committees and boards. Requests for information about Ethan's finances, his character references, his suitability as a guardian. Ethan burned each letter in the fireplace without responding. They want a reaction, he told Clara when she asked why he didn't defend himself. They want me to play their game. I won't. But his refusal to engage only made things worse. One morning, Clara woke to find Ethan already up, standing at the window with his coffee growing cold in his hand. She could tell something had changed by the set of his shoulders. What's wrong? He didn't turn around. There's a town meeting tonight about you and Lucy. Clara's stomach dropped. A meeting? Preston called it. Says the community needs to discuss the situation, decide what's in the best interests of the children. His voice was bitter. Which means they've already decided and they just want to make it official. Are you going? I don't have a choice. If I don't show up, they'll say I'm hiding something. Then we'll come too. No. Ethan turned to face her, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. You and Lucy stay here. No matter what happens at that meeting, you stay here. Understand? Clara wanted to argue, but something in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she nodded slowly. That evening, Ethan dressed in clothes Clara had never seen him wear. A proper shirt and vest, clean pants, boots without manure on them. He looked uncomfortable, like a wild animal forced into a cage. Lock the door after I leave, he instructed. Don't open it for anyone except me. Mr. Carter, I mean it, Clara. Anyone. He left as the sun was setting, riding toward town on his big roan horse. Clara watched from the window until he disappeared over the ridge, then turned to find Lucy staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. It's going to be okay, Clara said, though she had no idea if that was true. They waited. The hours crawled past. Clara tried to keep busy, washing dishes, mending clothes, stoking the fire, but her mind kept drifting to that town hall, imagining what was being said, what was being decided. Lucy fell asleep eventually, exhausted by worry. But Clara stayed awake, watching the darkness beyond the window, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. It was past midnight when she finally heard them. Clara rushed to the door, then remembered Ethan's warning and stopped with her hand on the latch. "Mr. Carter?" "It's me!" She threw open the door. Ethan stood there, snowflakes gathering on his shoulders, his face drawn and gray in the lamplight. "What happened?" He stepped inside and closed the door, moving like a man who'd aged 10 years in a single evening. He hung up his coat with careful, deliberate movements, then crossed to the fireplace and stood there, warming his hands. "Mr. Carter, please. What did they say?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "They voted. The town council. It was unanimous." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Voted for what?" "To remove you and Lucy from my care. They're giving me 1 week to make other arrangements. After that," he stopped, his throat working. "After that, they'll send the territorial marshal to collect you." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. 1 week, 7 days. And then they'd be torn away from this place, from this man who'd given them a home when no one else would. "There has to be something we can do," she said desperately. "Something. I tried everything." Ethan's voice cracked. "I offered to hire a housekeeper to make it more proper. I offered to let the church inspect the house weekly. I even offered to let one of their committee women move in as a chaperone. They said no to everything." "Why? Why do they care so much?" "Because Preston wants them to care. And because—" Ethan turned to face her, and Clara saw something like shame in his expression. "Because I'm not respectable. I haven't been to church in 5 years. I don't socialize or contribute to town causes. As far as they're concerned, I'm barely better than a hermit. And hermits don't get to raise children." Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "That's not fair." "Life isn't fair. I thought you'd learned that by now." The bitterness in his voice stung, but Clara pushed past it. "So we just give up? Let them win?" "We don't have a choice." "There's always a choice. Not this time." Ethan's voice rose, anger and grief tangling together. "I'm one man against an entire town council. I have no legal standing, no authority, no way to fight this. They hold all the power and they've made their decision." "Then we'll run," Clara said wildly. "We'll take the horses and go somewhere they can't find us. And live how? On what money? How long do you think we'd last before someone recognized us? Or before we froze? Or starved?" Ethan shook his head. "I won't put you through that. I won't." "But the orphanage. I know." His voice broke completely. "I know what it's like there. But at least you'll be alive. At least you'll have a roof and food and—" "We have that here." "It's not enough." Ethan's shout echoed through the room. Lucy stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. He lowered his voice, but the anguish in it was even worse. "Don't you understand? I can't protect you from this. I can't keep you safe. I'm failing you the same way I failed my wife, my daughter." "That's not true," Clara said fiercely. "You saved us. You gave us more than we ever hoped for. If they take us away, it's not because you failed. It's because they're cruel and small-minded and—" She stopped, because Ethan had turned away, his shoulders shaking. And Clara realized with a shock that he was crying, silently, painfully, like a man who'd forgotten how. She crossed to him and did something she'd never done before. She reached up and wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight. For a moment, Ethan stood rigid. Then his hands came up and gripped her shoulders, and he bent his head and wept like his heart was breaking. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other against the cold and the unfairness of a world that seemed determined to tear apart anyone who dared to care. And Clara made a promise to herself. 1 week. They had 1 week. And she would use every single day of it to find a way to stay. The next morning, Clara did something she'd never done before. She left the ranch without Ethan's permission. She waited until he was out checking the cattle, then bundled Lucy into her warmest clothes and set out walking toward town. It was 3 miles, and the going was hard through the snow, but Clara pushed forward with grim determination. "Where are we going?" Lucy asked, struggling to keep up. "To talk to people, to find someone who will help us." "Who?" Clara didn't have a good answer for that, but she couldn't just sit at the ranch waiting for the marshal to arrive. She had to try something. Town was smaller than she remembered, just a main street with a handful of buildings, houses scattered around the edges. Clara headed straight for the general store, the largest building and the one most likely to have people inside. A bell jingled as they entered. The warmth hit them immediately, along with the smells of coffee and tobacco and dry goods. 3 men stood near the stove, and a woman browsed bolts of fabric near the back. Behind the counter stood Councilman Preston himself. His eyes narrowed when he saw them. "Well, the Carter girls, as I live and breathe." Clara lifted her chin. "We're the Hale sisters, and we came to talk to you." "Did you now?" Preston's smile was cold. "And does Mr. Carter know you're here?" "No, sir, but—" "Then I suggest you run along back before he worries. Town is no place for unescorted children." The men by the stove chuckled. Clara felt her face flush, but she held her ground. "Please, Mr. Preston, I need you to understand. Mr. Carter has been good to us. He's given us a home and taught us how to work, and—" "I'm sure he has," Preston interrupted. "But that doesn't change the impropriety of the situation. Now run along." "We don't want to go to the orphanage," Lucy said suddenly, her small voice clear in the quiet store. "We want to stay with Mr. Carter." Preston's expression didn't soften. "What you want isn't the issue, child. It's what's proper and right." "How is it right to take us away from someone who cares about us?" Clara demanded. "How is it proper to send us somewhere we'll be cold and hungry? And—" "That's quite enough." Preston's voice turned sharp. "I won't be lectured by a child on matters of morality and community standards. The decision has been made, and it stands. Now leave my store before I have you escorted out." Clara wanted to argue more, but the men by the stove were starting to look uncomfortable, and the woman at the fabric counter was staring. She grabbed Lucy's hand and turned toward the door. "Clara." She stopped at the sound of a new voice. A young woman had emerged from the back room, maybe 20 years old, with kind eyes and brown hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet. "I'm Lydia Rowan," the woman said softly. I heard what you said about Mr. Carter." Preston's face darkened. "Lydia, this doesn't concern you." "I think it does, Father." Lydia kept her eyes on Clara. "I've seen Mr. Carter in town a few times over the years. He's always been polite, hardworking, and I've heard he's treated you girls well." "He has," Clara said eagerly. "He's been kind and—" "Lydia." Preston's voice carried a warning. "We've discussed this. The man is unsuitable." "Because he doesn't come to church?" Lydia's voice was gentle but firm. "Or because he keeps to himself?" "Because he's a single man living with 2 young girls who aren't his kin. The appearance alone is enough to—" "Then change the appearance." Preston blinked. "What?" "If the problem is that he's a single man, then make it so he's not." The store went very quiet. Clara didn't understand what Lydia was suggesting, but she could see from Preston's expression that he did, and he didn't like it. "Absolutely not," he said flatly. "You will not—" "I'm 21, Father, old enough to make my own decisions." Lydia looked at Clara again, and something in her expression made Clara's heart skip. "Where is Mr. Carter now?" "At the ranch, working." "Then I think I should pay him a visit." "Lydia Elizabeth Rowan, you will do no such thing." But Lydia was already untying her apron, already reaching for her coat. She moved with quiet determination, ignoring her father's increasingly agitated protests. "You girls wait here," she told Clara. "I'll take you back in my wagon." 10 minutes later, they were rolling out of town with Preston's angry shouts following them into the cold morning air. Clara sat beside Lydia on the wagon seat, her mind racing with questions she didn't know how to ask. Lydia seemed to sense her confusion. "I know what you're wondering," she said quietly. "Why would I do this? Why would I involve myself in a stranger's troubles?" "Yes, ma'am." "Because I've watched my father and his friends destroy good people for no reason other than they don't fit into the neat little boxes this town demands, and I'm tired of it." Lydia's hands tightened on the reins. "And because I think everyone deserves a chance at family, even people who've lost theirs." "Are you going to help us?" Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, small and uncertain, but real. "I'm going to try." When they reached the ranch, Ethan was standing in the yard with an expression that suggested he'd been about 5 minutes away from riding to town himself. His relief turned to confusion when he saw Lydia climbing down from the wagon. "Miss Rowan, what are you—" He stopped, looking at Clara. Where have you been? I went to talk to your father, Clara said to Lydia, then turned to Ethan. I'm sorry. I know you said to stay here, but I had to try something. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Lydia stepped forward. Mr. Carter, may I speak with you? It's important. He looked between them, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Then he nodded curtly and gestured toward the house. Inside, all of you, before you freeze. They gathered around the fireplace, Ethan standing with his arms crossed, Lydia perched on the edge of the rocking chair, Clara and Lucy huddled together on their bedding. Say what you came to say, Ethan told Lydia. She took a breath, and Clara could see her gathering her courage. The town won't let you keep these girls because you're a single man. That's the heart of their objection, isn't it? That's part of it. Then the solution is simple. Stop being a single man. Ethan stared at her. What? Marry me. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Clara's mouth fell open. Lucy gasped. Ethan looked like he'd been struck. You can't be serious, he said finally. I'm completely serious. Lydia's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. It's a practical solution. If we're married, no one can claim impropriety. The girls could stay, and the town would have no grounds to remove them. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you took in 2 children who would have died otherwise. I know you've cared for them when no one else would. That tells me what kind of man you are. She paused. And I know what it's like to watch people you care about be destroyed by this town's judgment. Ethan shook his head slowly. This is insane. You'd throw away your life, tie yourself to a stranger, just to help 2 children who deserve a home? Yes. Lydia's eyes were bright but determined. Mr. Carter, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to pretend to. I'm offering a solution to an impossible problem. A marriage in name, if nothing else. Enough to satisfy the town and keep this family together. Why? Ethan's voice was rough. Why would you do this? Lydia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more personal. Because 5 years ago, my mother died giving birth to what would have been my baby sister. The midwife said the baby was too small, came too early. My father blamed my mother for being careless, for not following his rules carefully enough. And when she died, he just moved on, like she'd never existed. Lydia's hands clenched in her lap. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. But I've watched him and men like him break people for years, and I'm done being part of it. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Ethan stared at Lydia like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he looked at Clara and Lucy, these 2 girls who'd stumbled into his barn and somehow wormed their way into the empty spaces of his heart. If we did this, he said slowly, if we actually went through with it, you understand what you'd be getting? A ranch that barely breaks even, a man who doesn't talk much, 2 kids who aren't yours. I understand. And you'd still want to? Lydia met his eyes directly. I would. Ethan turned away, staring into the fire. Clara held her breath, afraid to hope, afraid to believe this might actually work. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. When? Lydia's face flooded with relief. As soon as possible, before the week is up. The town will know it's a sham. Let them know. As long as it's legal, they can't do anything about it. Ethan was quiet for another long moment. Then he turned back to them, and Clara saw something in his expression she'd never seen before, something that looked almost like hope. All right, he said quietly. Let's do it. Lucy threw her arms around Clara, both of them too stunned and relieved to speak. Lydia stood, smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. I'll make the arrangements, she said. We can have the ceremony here, at the ranch. Keep it simple and quick. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Ethan. Thank you, she said softly, for saying yes. I should be thanking you. Maybe we're helping each other. After she left, Ethan sank into the rocking chair and put his head in his hands. Clara and Lucy exchanged glances, then crept closer. Mr. Carter? Clara said hesitantly. Are you okay? He looked up at them, and his expression was complicated, grief and relief and fear all tangled together. I don't know, he said honestly, but I guess we're about to find out. 3 days. That's all the time they had to prepare for a wedding that nobody wanted except the people it would save. Lydia returned the next morning with a minister in tow. Not the town's regular preacher, but a circuit rider named Reverend Walsh, who asked no questions and seemed content to perform the ceremony for the small fee Lydia offered. He was an old man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly when he opened his worn Bible. "I'll need witnesses," he told them, sitting at the kitchen table while Ethan made coffee. "At least 2, besides the bride and groom." "The girls can do it," Lydia said, gesturing to Clara and Lucy. Reverend Walsh frowned slightly. "They're quite young." "They're the reason we're doing this," Ethan said flatly. "If anyone should witness it, it's them." The minister studied Ethan's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. We'll hold the ceremony day after tomorrow. That gives you time to file the proper paperwork with the territorial office." After he left, Lydia sat at the table with a list she'd been making. Clara watched her write in neat, careful script all the things that needed to be done, all the details that went into making a fake marriage look real enough to satisfy the law. "I'll need to move some of my things here," Lydia said, not looking up from her list. "Not everything. Just enough that it looks like I actually live here." "There's a bedroom upstairs," Ethan said. "The empty one. You can have that. And we should probably be seen together in town, at least once before the wedding. So it doesn't look completely sudden." "It is completely sudden. I know, but we need to make it seem like there was at least some courtship." Lydia finally looked up, and Clara saw the strain in her face. This was hard for her too, despite her determined front. "My father is going to fight this. He'll claim I'm being coerced or manipulated. We need to appear united." Ethan poured coffee into 2 cups and set one in front of Lydia. "What did he say when you told him?" "I didn't tell him. I left a note." She wrapped her hands around the cup, seeking its warmth. "He'll have found it by now. I imagine he's not pleased." That turned out to be an understatement. Preston arrived that afternoon with the town marshal and 2 other council members. They came in a wagon, and their faces carried the kind of righteous fury that made Clara's stomach clench with fear. Ethan met them in the yard, and Clara watched from the window as the confrontation unfolded. "Where is she?" Preston demanded, climbing down from the wagon. "Where's my daughter?" "Inside," Ethan said calmly, "and she's staying there." "Like hell she is. Lydia! Lydia, get out here this instant!" Lydia appeared in the doorway, her spine straight and her chin lifted. "I'm not going anywhere, Father." "You most certainly are. Pack your things. You're coming home. This is my home now." Preston's face went purple. "You haven't even married the man yet. You can't just—" "I'm 21 years old. I can make my own choices." "Not when those choices are clearly the result of manipulation and—" Preston turned his fury on Ethan. "What did you promise her? What lies did you tell to get her to agree to this farce?" "No lies," Ethan said quietly, "and no promises except the ones we'll make at the ceremony." "There's not going to be a ceremony." Preston stepped forward, his hand rising as if he might strike Ethan. The marshal moved to restrain him, but Lydia's voice cut through the tension. "If you try to stop me, I'll tell everyone what really happened to Mother." Preston froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and shaking. "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." Lydia's voice was cold. "Try to drag me back to that house, and I'll stand in the middle of Main Street and tell everyone how you refused to call the doctor because you said she was being weak. How you made her keep working even when she could barely stand. How you blamed her when the baby came too early because she'd lifted a bag of flour you told her to move." "Lydia, I've been quiet for 5 years, Father. I've let you pretend it was just a tragic accident. But if you interfere with this marriage, I will make sure everyone knows the truth." The silence that followed was terrible. Preston stood there, his whole body trembling with rage and something that might have been shame. Finally, he turned to the marshal. "This is coercion. You heard her threaten me." The marshal, a weathered man named Carson, shook his head slowly. "I heard a woman tell her father she'd speak the truth if he tried to control her life. That's not coercion, Preston. That's just someone standing up for herself." "But the marriage itself, it's clearly a sham to circumvent the council's decision about those girls. Is it illegal for a man and woman to marry?" Carson asked mildly. "No, but is there any law that says a marriage has to be based on love instead of practical concerns?" Of course not, but then I don't see what crime is being committed here. Carson tipped his hat to Lydia. Ma'am, if you're entering this marriage of your own free will, the law's got no quarrel with it. I am, Lydia said firmly. Preston looked between them, his face twisting with impotent fury. Then he pointed at Ethan, his hand shaking. This isn't over. The council will hear about this, and we'll find a way to— The council can go to hell, Ethan said quietly. Preston made a strangled sound of rage, then turned and stalked back to the wagon. The other council members followed, and within minutes they were disappearing over the ridge, leaving behind nothing but wagon ruts in the snow. Lydia sagged against the doorframe, the strength draining out of her now that the confrontation was over. Clara rushed to her side, and Lucy brought her the rocking chair. She sank into it, her hands trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you all had to hear that. Don't apologize, Ethan said. He stood by the window watching the wagon disappear. You just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in town. I know. He's going to make your life difficult. He already did. Lydia looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. At least now I'm choosing my own difficulties. That evening, after Lucy had fallen asleep by the fire, Clara found Lydia sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. She looked young and scared, and Clara realized with a start that Lydia was probably as frightened as they were, just better at hiding it. Miss Rowan? Lydia looked up, managing a small smile. You can call me Lydia. We're going to be family soon, after all. Clara sat down across from her. Are you sure you want to do this? Really sure? Are you asking if I'm going to change my mind? I'm asking if you're okay. Lydia's smile turned sad. I don't know if I'm okay, but I know I'm doing the right thing. She paused, then added quietly, My mother used to say that sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are miles apart, and you have to decide which road you're going to walk. She sounds like she was a good person. She was. She deserved better than what she got. Lydia's hands clenched on the table. I can't save her, but maybe I can help save you and Lucy. Maybe that's enough. It's more than enough, Clara said fiercely. It's everything. Lydia reached across the table and took Clara's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. Then let's make sure it works. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold. Ethan woke before sunrise and went about his chores with mechanical precision, his face drawn and distant. Clara helped where she could, but mostly she stayed out of his way, sensing he needed the solitude. Lydia arrived mid-morning in her wagon, her few belongings packed in 2 small trunks. She wore a simple dress, not white, because this wasn't that kind of wedding, but a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up carefully, and someone had given her a small bouquet of dried flowers tied with ribbon. My neighbor made it, she explained when she saw Clara staring. Mrs. Henderson. She was the only one who didn't try to talk me out of this. They helped carry Lydia's things upstairs to the empty bedroom. It didn't take long. She'd brought only the essentials. Clothes, a few books, a quilt her mother had made. Looking at the sparse collection, Clara realized how much Lydia was leaving behind. You can still change your mind, Clara said quietly, watching Lydia unpack. We'd understand. Lydia paused with a stack of dresses in her arms. Do you want me to change my mind? No, but I don't want you to regret it either. I won't. Lydia set the dresses in the wardrobe and turned to face Clara. I've lived in my father's house for 21 years, following his rules, being the perfect obedient daughter. And all it got me was a front row seat to watch him destroy anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of how people should live. She crossed to the window and looked out at the snow-covered prairie. This ranch, this marriage, it might not be what I dreamed of when I was a little girl. But it's mine, my choice, and that matters more than you know. Reverend Walsh arrived just after noon, accompanied by Mrs. Henderson as an additional witness. The old woman embraced Lydia fiercely and gave Ethan a long, measuring look. You treat her right, she said, her voice stern, or you'll answer to me. Yes, ma'am, Ethan replied quietly. They gathered in the main room, Ethan and Lydia standing before the fireplace. Clara and Lucy and Mrs. Henderson forming a small half-circle around them. Reverend Walsh opened his Bible, and the ceremony began. It was nothing like the weddings Clara had heard about. No music, no crowd of well-wishers, no joy in the faces of the bride and groom. Just two people speaking vows they didn't mean to a future they couldn't imagine, all to protect two children who watched with hearts full of desperate hope. Do you, Ethan James Carter, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Ethan's voice was steady. I do. And do you, Lydia Elizabeth Rowan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Lydia met Ethan's eyes, and something passed between them. Not love, but understanding. An acknowledgement of the bargain they were making, the sacrifice they were both choosing. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territorial government, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Walsh closed his Bible. You may kiss the bride. Ethan hesitated, and Clara saw panic flash across his face. But Lydia solved the problem by rising on her toes and pressing a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. There, she said softly. Done. And just like that, it was over. Clara and Lucy and Mrs. Henderson signed the marriage certificate as witnesses. Reverend Walsh collected his fee and departed with wishes for a long and happy union that rang hollow in the quiet house. Mrs. Henderson embraced Lydia one more time, whispered something in her ear that made Lydia's eyes fill with tears, and then she, too, was gone. The four of them stood in the silence that followed, two children and two adults who were now, legally at least, a family. Well, Ethan said finally, I suppose we should eat something. He'd prepared a meal earlier, nothing fancy, just roasted chicken and vegetables, and they sat down to the table together. Mr. and Mrs. Carter and the two girls who'd brought them together. Clara kept expecting it to feel different, monumental somehow. But it was just dinner, just four people eating in awkward silence while the weight of what they'd done settled over them. Lydia broke the quiet first. We should probably discuss how this is going to work. The living arrangements. Ethan set down his fork. You have your room, I have mine. Nothing about that needs to change. And the girls? They can keep sleeping by the fire if they want, or we can set up the third bedroom properly. Whatever they prefer. I'd like to sleep by the fire, Lucy said quickly. If that's okay. That's fine, Lydia managed a smile. And during the day, how do we present ourselves? As what we are. Housemates who married for practical reasons. The town won't believe that. I don't care what the town believes. Ethan's voice was hard. As long as it's legal and they can't take the girls, they can think whatever they want. Lydia nodded slowly, but Clara could see the strain in her face. This was harder than she'd expected. Harder than any of them had expected. That night, after the girls had settled by the fire and Ethan had retreated to his room, Clara heard soft footsteps on the stairs. She opened her eyes to see Lydia descending, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. Lydia didn't notice Clara watching. She crossed to the window and stood there, staring out at the darkness, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Clara wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but something told her Lydia needed this moment alone, needed to grieve for the life she'd given up, the dreams she'd sacrificed, the person she might have been if the world had been kinder. So Clara stayed quiet and let Lydia cry. And eventually the new Mrs. Carter wiped her eyes and went back upstairs to sleep in a strange bed in a house that wasn't quite home. The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She sat up to find Lydia at the stove, still in her nightgown with a borrowed apron tied over it, cooking breakfast. Good morning, Lydia said, and her voice was steady again. The grief from last night was locked away, replaced by determined practicality. I hope you don't mind. I thought I should start earning my keep. Ethan came down the stairs, saw Lydia at his stove, and stopped halfway to the kitchen. You don't have to. I know, but I want to. Lydia plated eggs and bacon with efficient movements. We all need to contribute. That's how this works, isn't it? Something in her tone made Ethan pause. Then he nodded and took his seat at the table. They ate together, the first breakfast of their new arrangement. And if it was awkward and stilted, if none of them quite knew how to act around each other, at least they were all trying. After breakfast, Lydia insisted on helping with the chores. Ethan tried to protest, but she cut him off with a look that reminded Clara of her mother when she'd made up her mind about something. I'm not some delicate flower who needs protecting from work, Lydia said firmly. I grew up on a ranch before my father decided storekeeping was more respectable. I know how to milk a cow and muck a stall. So they worked together, Ethan showing Lydia where everything was kept, Lydia proving she could indeed handle ranch work, Clara and Lucy doing their usual tasks. And slowly, gradually, the ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. But the town wasn't done with them yet. 2 days after the wedding, Marshal Carson arrived with an official-looking document. Clara's heart sank when she saw him ride up, but his expression was more apologetic than threatening. "Sorry to bother you folks," he said, accepting the coffee Lydia offered. "But I've got a summons here from the territorial court. Councilman Preston filed a petition claiming the marriage was fraudulent." Ethan's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" "Says it was entered into solely to circumvent the council's decision regarding the custody of the Hale girls. Says there's no real marital relationship and therefore the marriage should be annulled." "That's ridiculous," Lydia said. "We're legally married. We have the certificate." "I know, ma'am, and between you and me, I think Preston's grasping at straws, but the court has to hear the petition." Carson set a paper on the table. "You're both required to appear before Judge Morrison next month. He'll make the final determination." After Carson left, Ethan and Lydia stared at each other across the table. "They're not going to let this go," Lydia said quietly. "No, they're not." "What do we do?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara and Lucy, huddled together by the fire, and his expression hardened with resolve. "We make it real." Lydia blinked. "What?" "The marriage. We make it look real. Real enough that no judge can claim it's fraudulent." Ethan stood and began pacing. "We appear together in public. We act like a married couple. We make sure everyone sees us as a family. But we're not. I know what we're not, but we need to convince everyone else that we are." Ethan stopped pacing and looked at Lydia directly. "I'm not asking you to actually be a wife in all the ways that means. But if we're going to survive the court hearing, we need to be convincing." Lydia twisted her hands in her lap. "What did you have in mind?" "Sunday services. We go together, as a family. We sit in the front pew where everyone can see us. We show them that we're committed to this." "You haven't been to services in 5 years." "I know, but if I show up now with you and the girls, it sends a message. It says we're serious." Lydia looked at Clara and Lucy. "What do you think?" Clara thought about the orphanage, about the cold, and hunger, and loss. She thought about this ranch that had become home, about Ethan's quiet kindness and Lydia's brave sacrifice. "I think we do whatever it takes," she said firmly. And so they made a plan. They would present themselves to the town as a real family, united, committed, unshakable. They would attend services, make social calls, show their faces at town events. They would smile and pretend and lie through their teeth if necessary, because the alternative was losing everything they'd fought to protect. Sunday morning arrived with bright sunshine that felt like mockery. Clara helped Lucy into her best dress, the one from Ethan's trunk that had belonged to his daughter Emma. It fit well enough with a few tucks, and Lydia had added a ribbon at the waist. Clara wore a dress of Lydia's, altered to fit her smaller frame. Lydia emerged from her room in a respectable dark dress with a bonnet that made her look older and more severe. Ethan wore his wedding clothes, the only proper outfit he owned. They looked, Clara thought, like a normal family preparing for Sunday services, if you ignored the tension radiating from every one of them. The ride to town was quiet. They took the wagon, all 4 of them squeezed onto the bench seat. As they approached the church, Clara saw people turning to stare. Whispers spread through the crowd gathered outside like wildfire. "Look at that. Never thought I'd see Ethan Carter at church again. With his new wife and those girls. Shameful, the whole thing." Ethan's hands tightened on the reins, but his face remained impassive. He helped Lydia down from the wagon with exaggerated courtesy, then lifted Lucy down while Clara climbed down herself. They walked toward the church entrance as a unit, Lydia's hand resting on Ethan's arm, the girls flanking them. The crowd parted to let them through, and Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing, judging, finding them wanting. Inside the church, Ethan led them to a pew near the front, not the very first row, which would have been too obvious, but close enough to make a statement. As they settled in, Clara noticed Preston sitting across the aisle, his face purple with suppressed rage. Beside him sat Mrs. Simmons and the other members of the Ladies' Benevolent Society, all wearing identical expressions of disapproval. The service began, and Clara tried to focus on the minister's words, but she was hyper-aware of every whisper, every sideways glance, every nudge and murmur that rippled through the congregation. When it came time to stand for hymns, Ethan's voice rose beside her, rough and unpracticed, but there. Lydia sang in a clear soprano, and Clara joined in, her voice small but determined. Lucy pressed close to her side, humming when she didn't know the words. They looked, Clara hoped, like a family, like people who belonged together. After the service, they stood outside the church while people filed past. Most hurried by with barely a nod, but a few stopped, curious, judging, or in the case of Mrs. Henderson, genuinely kind. "Lovely to see you, Lydia," the old woman said, embracing her. "And Mr. Carter, welcome back. It's been too long." "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied quietly. "These girls look well cared for. You should be proud." "We are," Lydia said, and her hand tightened on Ethan's arm. Mrs. Simmons approached next, her smile thin and cold. "Mrs. Carter, how domestic you look." "Thank you, Mrs. Simmons." "And the girls, attending services now, how appropriate." Her eyes swept over Clara and Lucy with barely concealed disdain. "Though I must say it's remarkable how quickly they've adapted to their new situation." "Children are resilient," Lydia said smoothly. "Indeed, though one wonders if they truly understand the complexities of the arrangement." Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "The arrangement is simple, Mrs. Simmons. We're a family. There's nothing complex about it." "Of course not." Mrs. Simmons' smile didn't waver. "I'm sure the judge will agree." She swept away, leaving a chill in her wake. Clara saw Lydia's face go pale, but she maintained her composure, smiling and nodding as other townspeople passed. Preston was the last to approach. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on his daughter. "Lydia." "Father?" "You look well." "I am well." Preston's gaze shifted to Ethan, and Clara saw naked hatred there. "Carter." "Preston." "Enjoying your victory?" "There's no victory here, just people trying to live their lives." "Is that what you call it?" Preston's voice dripped with contempt. "You've corrupted my daughter, turned her against her own family, all for the sake of two orphaned brats who—" "Careful," Ethan said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "You're talking about my daughters." The word hung in the air. Daughters. Clara's breath caught. Lucy's hand found hers and squeezed tight. Preston's face twisted with fury. "They're not your daughters. They're not your blood. They're not your responsibility. And when Judge Morrison sees through this farce of a marriage, they'll be exactly where they belong. In the orphanage, learning their place in the world." "They already know their place," Lydia said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's with us, and no judge is going to change that." "We'll see about that." Preston tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts." He walked away, and Clara watched Lydia's composure finally crack. Her shoulders sagged and tears welled in her eyes. "Lydia," Ethan started. "I'm fine," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "I'm fine. Let's just go home." They climbed back into the wagon in silence. As they rolled out of town, Clara looked back at the church, at the cluster of people still standing outside, watching them leave. She thought about Preston's words, fantasy, farce, and felt a cold fear settle in her chest. What if he was right? What if the judge saw through their pretense? What if all of this, the wedding, the sacrifice, the hope, was for nothing? "Clara." Ethan's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Look at me." She turned to find him watching her, his expression serious but not unkind. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever the judge decides, you and Lucy are not going back to the cold. You're not going to the orphanage. I won't allow it." "But if the marriage is annulled, then we'll find another way. Run if we have to. Leave the territory. Start over somewhere else." His hands tightened on the reins. "I've lost one family. I'm not losing another." Beside him, Lydia nodded in agreement. "We're in this together now." All of us. Lucy buried her face against Clara's shoulder, and Clara held her close, blinking back tears. They were a family born of desperation and held together by determination. Not the family any of them had expected or planned for, but a family nonetheless. And families, Clara was learning, fought for each other, even when the odds seemed impossible, even when the world wanted to tear them apart. The wagon rolled on through the snow, carrying them home to the ranch where they would make their stand. The weeks that followed felt like living under siege. Every Sunday they returned to church, enduring the stares and whispers with forced smiles. Every trip to town for supplies became an exercise in maintaining appearances. Lydia walked with her hand on Ethan's arm, the picture of a devoted wife. Ethan treated her with careful courtesy, opening doors and helping her into the wagon. Clara and Lucy stayed close, two well-behaved children who called them Ma and Pa when anyone was listening. But at the ranch, in the privacy of their own walls, they were still four separate people trying to figure out how to live together. Lydia threw herself into making the house a home. She sewed curtains for the windows, organized the kitchen with ruthless efficiency, and started a small herb garden in pots on the windowsill. She taught Lucy how to knead bread and showed Clara how to preserve vegetables for winter. She moved through the house like a woman determined to prove she belonged there, even if she wasn't entirely sure she did. Ethan worked harder than ever, as if he could outrun his doubts through sheer physical exhaustion. He rose before dawn and came in after dark, smelling of hay and cattle and cold air. He was unfailingly polite to Lydia, but distant, like a man afraid to get too close to something he might lose. Clara watched them both and saw the strain building. They were playing their parts well enough to fool the town, but the performance was taking its toll. It came to a head 3 weeks before the court hearing. Clara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of raised voices. She sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Lucy, and saw light coming from the kitchen. Ethan and Lydia's voices drifted through the doorway, not shouting, but intense with barely controlled emotion. "Can't keep doing this, what?" Lydia was saying. "Walking on eggshells, pretending everything is fine when it's clearly not. What do you want me to do?" Ethan's voice was rough with exhaustion. "I'm doing the best I can." "I know you are, but this isn't working. We're living like strangers under the same roof." "That's what we are." "No." Lydia's voice turned sharp. "We're a married couple trying to protect 2 children, and if we can't even talk to each other honestly, how are we supposed to convince a judge we're a real family?" There was a long silence. Clara crept closer to the kitchen doorway, staying in the shadows where they couldn't see her. "What do you want from me, Lydia?" Ethan asked finally, and he sounded lost. "I'm not good at this. I don't know how to be what you need." "I don't need you to be anything except honest with me." Lydia's voice softened. "We made this choice together. Both of us knew it would be hard, but we can't keep pretending it's easy either." "I'm not pretending it's easy. I'm just trying to survive it." "Is that what this is to you? Something to survive?" "What else should it be?" Ethan's chair scraped against the floor. "We got married to save those girls from the orphanage. That's what this is. That's all it can be." "Why?" The question came out almost desperate. "Why does it have to be that and nothing more?" "Because," Ethan's voice broke, "because I can't do this again. I can't let myself care about someone just to watch them leave or die or, I'm not Sarah." The name dropped like a stone into still water. Clara held her breath. "I know you're not," Ethan said quietly, "but that doesn't change what I can't give you. I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm asking you to let me in, just a little, so we can be partners in this instead of 2 people performing a script." Another long silence. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know if I can." Clara heard Lydia's chair scrape back, heard her footsteps cross the kitchen. Then more gently she heard her say, "Then maybe it's time to learn." Footsteps on the stairs, a door closing softly, and then just Ethan, alone in the kitchen, with only the sound of his breathing and the crackle of the dying fire. Clara retreated back to her bedding, her mind churning. She'd known this arrangement was fragile, built on desperation and necessity. But hearing the pain in both their voices made her realize just how much they were sacrificing, not just their freedom to choose their own lives, but their ability to protect their hearts from more hurt. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Lydia moved through breakfast preparations with mechanical efficiency, not meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan ate in silence, then disappeared to the barn without a word. Lucy looked between them with worried eyes, but Clara shook her head slightly. Not now. It was Clara who finally broke the stalemate. That afternoon, while Ethan was out checking fence lines and Lydia was washing dishes with more force than necessary, Clara approached her at the sink. "You're going to break that plate if you keep scrubbing it that hard." Lydia startled, then looked down at the dish in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. She set it in the drying rack with exaggerated care. "Sorry, I was thinking." "About last night?" Lydia's hands stilled in the wash water. "You heard that?" "Some of it. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it's all right." Lydia pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron. "This house isn't big enough for secrets anyway." Clara chose her next words carefully. "Mr. Carter, Ethan, he's scared." "I know." Not of the court hearing, not of Preston or the town. Clara looked towards the window where she could see Ethan in the distance, a dark figure against the snow. "He's scared of caring about people again, because everyone he's cared about has been taken away." Lydia leaned against the counter, her expression weary. "I know that too. But Clara, I can't spend the rest of my life living with someone who won't even try to let me close. I didn't give up everything just to be tolerated." "He doesn't just tolerate you. I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching." "How does he look at me?" "Like he's trying to figure out if you're real, like he's afraid to believe you might actually stay." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not going anywhere. Doesn't he know that?" "I don't think he does. I don't think he can let himself believe it yet." Clara moved closer. "My mama used to say that trust is like a muscle. If you don't use it, it gets weak. Mr. Carter's trust has been weak for a long time. So what do I do?" "Keep trying. Keep being here. Eventually, he'll have to see that you mean it." Lydia wiped her eyes and managed a tremulous smile. "When did you get so wise?" "When I had to be." Clara returned to her task of peeling potatoes, then added quietly, "And maybe try talking to him during the day. When you're both not exhausted. When it doesn't feel like everything is falling apart." That evening, Lydia took Clara's advice. When Ethan came in from his work, instead of retreating to the kitchen or upstairs, she asked him to help her move a heavy trunk in the storage room. It was a transparent excuse. The trunk wasn't that heavy, and it didn't really need moving, but Ethan followed her anyway. Clara pretended to be engrossed in teaching Lucy her letters while listening to the murmur of voices from the other room. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was different from the night before, quieter, less confrontational. When they emerged 20 minutes later, something had shifted. Not dramatically. They didn't suddenly look like a couple in love, but some of the tension had eased from both their faces. At supper that night, Ethan asked Lydia about her mother's herb garden, and Lydia told stories about growing up on a ranch before her father decided town life was more profitable. It was the first real conversation Clara had heard them have, and it felt like watching ice begin to crack. Small things began to change after that night. Ethan started coming in earlier from his work, timing his return to when Lydia was making supper. He'd ask if she needed help, and she'd find small tasks for him, chopping vegetables, stoking the fire. They worked side by side in companionable silence, and gradually the silence became less awkward. Lydia started joining Ethan on morning chores, claiming she needed the fresh air. She proved surprisingly capable with the cattle, and Ethan began teaching her things he'd never bothered to explain before. How to spot signs of illness in a cow. How to predict weather by watching the sky. Clara watched them orbit each other like cautious planets, drawn together by necessity but held apart by fear. But the orbit was tightening, she noticed. They stood a little closer, spoke a little easier. Sometimes Lydia's hand would brush Ethan's arm, and he wouldn't flinch away. But the fragile peace was shattered when Marshal Carson appeared at the ranch again, his face grim. "Got more news from Preston," he said, declining coffee. "He's filed an additional complaint with the court, claims he has witnesses who will testify the marriage is a sham." "What witnesses?" Lydia demanded. "The Ladies' Benevolent Society, Mrs. Simmons and her friends. They're prepared to testify that they've observed no genuine affection between you and Mr. Carter, that you maintain separate bedrooms, that the whole arrangement appears to be purely transactional." Ethan's face went dark. "They've been spying on us?" Making observations, they call it. Anytime you're in town, they're watching, taking notes. Carson looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I know it's not right, but the judge will likely hear their testimony. After he left, Lydia sank into a chair, her face pale. Separate bedrooms. They're going to use that against us. We agreed you'd have your own space, Ethan said. That was the arrangement. I know, but if the judge thinks we're not really married in every sense, we're not. I know that, Lydia's voice rose with frustration, but we need him to believe we are, or at least that we could be, that this marriage is real and permanent and… She stopped, pressing her hands to her face. I don't know what to do. Clara and Lucy exchanged glances. Lucy looked scared, but Clara felt something else building inside her, a hot, fierce anger at these people who kept trying to destroy what they'd built. Then we give them what they want to see, Clara said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. What do you mean? Lydia asked. They want to see affection? We show them affection. They want to see you acting like a real married couple? We make sure that's what they see. Clara's hands clenched. We already go to church together, but maybe we need to do more. Go to town dances, accept dinner invitations. Let people see you together in ways that leave no doubt. Clara's right, Lucy chimed in. At church last week, the Hendersons invited us to their barn dance next month. We should go. I don't dance, Ethan said flatly. Then you'll learn, Lydia said, and there was steel in her voice. Because Clara's right. We've been playing defense, just trying to survive their scrutiny. Maybe it's time to go on offense. Over the next 2 weeks, they threw themselves into being visible. They accepted the Hendersons' invitation to the barn dance. They attended a town social at the church hall. They made a point of being seen together, Ethan's hand at Lydia's waist, Lydia smiling up at him, both of them creating the image of a couple who belonged together. It was exhausting. Every outing required careful choreography. Every interaction had to appear natural, while being anything but. Clara watched Ethan struggle with the performance, saw him force himself to touch Lydia's hand or smile at her jokes, saw Lydia pretend not to notice his discomfort while maintaining her own bright facade. But slowly, something strange began to happen. The performances started feeling less like performances. Ethan's smiles came a little easier. Lydia's hand in his began to seem natural. At the barn dance, when Ethan had to dance with Lydia despite his protests, Clara saw them laugh together, really laugh, when he stepped on her feet for the third time. I warned you, Seg, he said, looking genuinely chagrined. You did, Lydia agreed, still laughing. But I didn't believe you were this bad. I can still milk a cow and fix a fence. Just can't dance to save your life. Lucky dancing isn't required for ranching. They finished the dance, and when the music ended, Ethan didn't immediately let go of Lydia's waist. They stood there for a moment, both slightly breathless, both smiling, and Clara saw something pass between them that looked almost like real affection. On the ride home that night, Lucy fell asleep against Clara's shoulder. In the seat beside them, Ethan and Lydia sat closer than usual, their shoulders touching as the wagon rocked over the frozen ground. You did well tonight, Lydia said softly. I stepped on your feet at least 12 times. Only 9. I counted. She bumped his shoulder with hers. But you tried. That's what matters. Did it look convincing? I think so. Mrs. Henderson said we made a lovely couple. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly Clara almost missed it, he said, We did, didn't we? Lydia's hand found his on the wagon seat, and this time when their fingers intertwined, it wasn't for show. There was no one to see them except 2 half-asleep children in the back of the wagon. Clara closed her eyes and allowed herself a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, something real was beginning to grow from the seeds of their desperate arrangement. But there was still the court hearing looming ahead, and Preston wasn't done fighting. The summons to appear before Judge Morrison came 2 weeks before the scheduled hearing, but along with it came another document, a petition for emergency custody filed by the Ladies' Benevolent Society. They claimed that Clara and Lucy were being exposed to an immoral living situation and requested immediate removal pending the court's final decision on the marriage's validity. When Marshal Carson delivered the news, his face was apologetic but firm. They've got the signatures of 15 prominent citizens, including 3 town council members. The judge has granted a preliminary hearing for tomorrow. You'll need to appear and argue why the girls shouldn't be removed immediately. Tomorrow? Lydia's voice was sharp with panic. That's not enough time to… I know. I argued for more notice, but Preston pushed hard for immediate action. Carson looked at the girls huddled together by the fire. I'm sorry. I really am. After he left, Ethan paced the room like a caged animal. They're boxing us in, forcing our hand before we're ready. What do we say at the hearing? Lydia asked. How do we prove we're providing a good home? We tell the truth, that the girls are healthy, fed, educated, that they're better off here than anywhere else. Will that be enough? It has to be. But that night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay beside Lucy, listening to her sister's steady breathing, and thought about the orphanage, about cold rooms and thin blankets and children who coughed and never got better, about losing this home they'd fought so hard to keep. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to find weak dawn light filtering through the window and Lydia sitting beside her, already dressed. Clara, she whispered, can I talk to you? They moved to the kitchen, where Lydia poured 2 cups of weak tea and sat across from Clara at the table. I need you to understand something, Lydia said quietly. Whatever happens at that hearing today, I want you to know that Ethan and we're not going to give up. Even if the judge orders you to the orphanage temporarily, we'll fight it. We'll appeal. We'll do whatever it takes. I know. And I need you to be brave today. When the judge asks you questions, and he will, you need to answer honestly but carefully. Tell him about your life here. Tell him you're happy and safe. Can you do that? Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. What if it's not enough? What if he takes us anyway? Then we'll find another way. But Clara… Lydia reached across the table and took her hand. I need you to believe that we're going to win this, because if you don't believe it, I'm not sure I can either. Clara looked at this woman who'd given up her entire life to save 2 children she barely knew, who'd married a stranger and endured her father's hatred and the town's judgment, all to keep them safe. I believe it, Clara said, and tried to make it true. The courthouse was a square stone building in the center of town, imposing and cold. Judge Morrison presided from behind a massive oak desk, his white beard and stern expression making him look like something out of a storybook, the kind where the judge was never kind. Preston sat on one side of the room with Mrs. Simmons and 2 other society members. Ethan and Lydia sat on the other with Clara and Lucy between them. The girls wore their best dresses, hair carefully braided, looking as respectable as Lydia could make them. The judge called the hearing to order and reviewed the petition. Then he looked directly at Clara and Lucy. Girls, please stand. They rose on shaky legs. Clara felt Lydia's hand squeeze her shoulder once, then release. I'm going to ask you some questions, Judge Morrison said, his voice surprisingly gentle. I need you to answer truthfully. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Clara said. Beside her, Lucy nodded. How long have you been living with Mr. and Mrs. Carter? Clara did the math quickly. Almost 4 months, sir, since January. And before that, where did you live? In a cabin 5 miles south of here, with our mother. But she died, and we had nowhere else to go. So you came to Mr. Carter's ranch? Yes, sir. We saw smoke from his chimney and thought maybe someone could help us. And did he? Help you? Clara thought about that first night, the warmth of the fire, the hot broth, the blankets that smelled of cedar. Ethan's gruff kindness that had saved their lives. Yes, sir, he gave us food and a warm place to sleep. He let us stay when he could have sent us away. And now, how does he treat you? He teaches us how to work on the ranch, how to take care of ourselves. He makes sure we have enough to eat and warm clothes to wear. The judge made a note, then turned to Lucy. And you, child, are you happy at the ranch? Lucy's voice was small but clear. Yes, sir. Mr. Carter and Miss Lydia, Mrs. Carter, they're kind to us, and I like feeding the chickens. A small smile flickered across the judge's face, quickly suppressed. I see. And Mrs. Carter, she treats you well also? Oh, yes, sir. She teaches us how to cook and sew, and she tells us stories at night sometimes, and Lucy's voice wavered. She makes us feel like we matter. The simple honesty of it seemed to strike something in the room. Even Preston shifted uncomfortably. Judge Morrison turned to Preston. Councilman, do you wish to question the children? Preston stood, his face hard. I do, Your Honor. Miss Clara, you say Mr. Carter has been kind to you, but isn't it true that he made you work? That you have to earn your keep through manual labor unsuitable for children? Clara lifted her chin. He taught us how to work, sir. There's a difference. Is there? You milk cows, clean stalls, chop wood. I learn useful skills that will help me survive, Clara interrupted, her voice growing stronger. Before we came to the ranch, I didn't know how to do anything except watch my mother die and be hungry. Now I know how to take care of myself. How is that unsuitable? Preston's face darkened. Your Honor, this child has clearly been coached. I haven't been coached, Clara said fiercely. I'm telling the truth. Mr. Carter and Ms. Pa Carter saved our lives. And if you send us to the orphanage, you might as well have let us freeze on the prairie, because at least that would have been faster. Clara, Ethan started, but the judge held up a hand. Let her speak, Mr. Carter. He looked at Clara with something that might have been respect. Continue, child. Clara's hands shook, but she kept going. I know what people say about Mr. Carter and Mrs. Carter. I know they think the marriage isn't real, that it's just to keep us from being taken away, but I've lived in that house for 4 months. I've watched them work together and eat together and become, she struggled for the right word, become family. Maybe it started as an arrangement, but it's not that anymore. They care about each other. They care about us, and that's more real than anything I've ever seen. The room was silent when she finished. Lucy reached for her hand and held it tight. Have concerns about the living, have concerns about the living arrangements. What are those concerns specifically? Mrs. Simmons stood, her spine rigid with righteousness. Your Honor, it's simply not proper for 2 young girls to be living with a man who was, until recently, a complete stranger to them. The fact that he married to legitimize the situation doesn't change the fundamental impropriety of it. And if he hadn't married? If he'd simply taken them to the orphanage as you all insisted he should? Then they would be in a proper institutional setting with appropriate supervision. I visited that orphanage, Mrs. Simmons. Last year, 8 children died there from illness and malnutrition. Is that the appropriate supervision you're referring to? Mrs. Simmons' face flushed. That's an unfortunate. The orphanage does the best it can with limited resources. Exactly. Limited resources. While Mr. Carter's ranch has ample resources to care for 2 additional children. The judge leaned forward. Tell me, Mrs. Simmons, have you personally observed any mistreatment of these girls? Well, no, but any signs of neglect? Hunger? Abuse? Not as such, but the mere appearance of impropriety is not, in itself, grounds for removing children from a home where they are clearly thriving. Judge Morrison's voice was firm. Unless you have actual evidence of wrongdoing, your concerns about appearances do not outweigh these children's welfare. He turned to Ethan and Lydia. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, please stand. They rose together, Lydia's hand finding Ethan's. I've heard the arguments on both sides, the judge said, and I'm prepared to make my ruling on the emergency petition. He paused, and Clara's heart nearly stopped. The petition for immediate removal is denied. Relief flooded through Clara so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. Beside her, Lucy made a small sound of joy. However, the judge continued, and Clara's relief turned to ice. The question of the marriage's validity remains. I will schedule a full hearing for 1 month from today. At that time, I will make a final determination on whether this union is legitimate or whether it was entered into fraudulently for the purpose of circumventing the custody decision. His gaze settled on Ethan and Lydia. I suggest you both be prepared to demonstrate that this marriage is genuine in every meaningful sense. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, they said in unison. Then this hearing is adjourned. The girls will remain in the Carters' custody pending the final hearing. The gavel came down, and it was over. For now, they'd won. But the final battle still loomed ahead, 1 month away, with everything they'd built hanging in the balance. Outside the courthouse, they stood in a small circle while the town dispersed around them. Preston swept past without a word, his face thunderous. Mrs. Simmons and her companions followed, their skirts rustling with indignation. Only Mrs. Henderson paused to squeeze Lydia's hand and whisper, You did well in there, all of you. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, not tense with fear, but heavy with the weight of what still lay ahead. 1 month, 30 days to prove their marriage was real in every meaningful sense. As the judge had said, Clara didn't fully understand what that meant, But she saw the way Ethan and Lydia sat beside each other on the wagon seat, not touching, but acutely aware of each other's presence, and she knew something fundamental had shifted. That evening, after supper had been cleared and Lucy had fallen asleep by the fire, Ethan asked Lydia to walk with him. Clara watched from the window as they crossed the yard toward the barn, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. They disappeared inside, and she wondered what they were saying to each other in the privacy of lamplight and animal warmth. They returned an hour later, and though neither said anything about their conversation, Clara noticed that when Lydia went upstairs to her room that night, Ethan stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment, his hand on the banister, looking up like a man trying to decide whether to follow. He didn't. Not that night. But something had changed in his face. The wall he'd built around himself had developed a crack, and light was starting to seep through. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard wagon wheels and looked up to see not one but 3 wagons approaching. Her heart jumped. More trouble from town. But then she recognized Mrs. Henderson driving the first one. Ethan emerged from the barn, his expression wary. Lydia came out of the house, drying her hands on her apron. They stood together as the wagons pulled up, and Clara hurried over with Lucy close behind. Mrs. Henderson climbed down first, followed by 5 other women Clara recognized from town. Not members of Mrs. Simmons' society, but quieter women who'd always offered small kindnesses at church. "Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Henderson said, addressing Lydia. "We've come to help." "Help with what?" Lydia asked, confused. "With preparing for the hearing," Mrs. Henderson gestured to the other women. "We've all been talking since yesterday's proceedings. What that judge said about proving your marriage is genuine. Well, we thought we could help with that." One of the other women stepped forward. Clara recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house. Mrs. Simmons and her friends have been spreading their poison for weeks now, but some of us remember what it was like when Mr. Carter lost his wife and daughter. We saw how he shut himself away from the world. And we've seen how he's changed since you came into his life, Mrs. Carter. All of you. "We want to testify," another woman added. "At the final hearing, we want to tell the judge what we've observed, that you're a real family, that those girls are being well cared for, that this marriage is as genuine as any we've seen." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "You do that for us? We do it for what's right," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "and for those girls who deserve a home." Ethan, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke. "Why?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Most of you barely know us. Why risk Preston's anger to help?" Mrs. Henderson met his eyes directly. "Because 5 years ago, when my husband died and left me with 3 children and a failing farm, you showed up with 2 of your hired hands and spent a week helping me bring in the harvest. You never asked for payment, never mentioned it again. You just did what needed doing." "That was different." "No, it wasn't. It was the same thing you did for these girls. You saw people who needed help, and you helped them." She looked around at the other women. "We've all got stories like that. Small kindnesses you did when you thought no one was watching. It's time someone stood up for you, the way you've stood up for others." The women stayed for an hour, sharing coffee and making plans. They would attend the final hearing as a group. They would speak about the changes they'd observed in Ethan, the strength they saw in Lydia, the obvious bond developing between all 4 members of this unlikely family. They would counter every accusation Preston and his allies might raise. After they left, Lydia stood in the yard watching the wagons disappear, her face wet with tears. "I didn't think anyone cared," she said quietly. Ethan stood beside her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Neither did I." That night, something changed between them. Clara woke to use the privy and noticed light coming from Ethan's room upstairs. She climbed the stairs quietly and saw his door ajar. Inside, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, holding something small in his hands. As Clara got closer, she saw it was the wooden horse from Emma's room, the one she'd seen on the windowsill months ago. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up, not startled, as if he'd known she was there. "Can't sleep?" "No, sir." She hesitated in the doorway. "Can I come in?" He nodded, and she sat beside him on the bed. Up close, she could see how worn the little horse was, its edges smooth from years of handling. "I made this for Emma," he said softly. "When Sarah was pregnant, I carved it from a piece of apple wood, spent weeks getting it just right." He ran his thumb over the horse's mane. She loved it, slept with it every night. It's beautiful. After they died, I couldn't bear to look at it, put it away in that room and locked the door. Told myself I'd never open it again. He was quiet for a moment. Then you and Lucy showed up, and suddenly the house had children in it again, children's voices and footsteps and laughter. And it hurt, but it also felt right somehow, like the house was remembering what it was supposed to be. You miss them, Clara said softly. Every day. But Clara, I need you to understand something. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were earnest. When I said you and Lucy were my daughters in that courtroom, I meant it. Not as a legal technicality or a performance for the judge. I meant it. Clara's throat tightened. Even though we're not your blood? Blood doesn't make a family. Choice does. I chose to take you in that first night, and I've chosen to keep you every day since. That makes you mine just as surely as if I'd brought you into this world myself. A tear rolled down Clara's cheek. I chose you too. Both of you. You and Lydia. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. They sat there in the lamplight, this man and this girl who'd found each other in desperate circumstances and decided to become family. Mr. Carter? Clara said after a while. Lydia chose us too, you know, not just me and Lucy. All of us, including you. She felt him tense slightly. I know. Do you? Because sometimes I think you're still waiting for her to leave, like you don't believe she really wants to be here. It's not that I don't believe her. Then what is it? Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm afraid, Clara. I'm afraid to let myself care about her the way I cared about Sarah, because if I lose her too, you might, Clara said bluntly. People die. People leave. That's life. But Mr. Carter, you can't live your whole life afraid of losing people, because then you never really have them at all. He looked at her with something like wonder. When did you get so smart? When I had to be, she said, echoing what she'd told Lydia weeks ago. But I mean it. Lydia's not going anywhere. She gave up everything to be here. Her home, her father, her whole life. Don't you think that deserves more than you keeping her at arm's length? Ethan set the wooden horse carefully on his nightstand. What are you suggesting I do? Talk to her. Really talk to her. Tell her what you just told me, that you're afraid but you're trying, that she matters to you. Clara stood up. And maybe stop making her sleep in a different room like she's a stranger you're tolerating instead of your wife. She left before he could respond, padding back down the stairs to her bedding by the fire. But she noticed that Ethan's light stayed on for a long time after that, and she heard his footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor. The next morning, Ethan was quieter than usual at breakfast. But Clara noticed how his eyes kept drifting to Lydia, and how he found small excuses to stay near her, asking if she needed help with the dishes, offering to bring in more firewood, lingering over his coffee long after he'd normally have headed out to the barn. Lydia noticed too. Clara saw the small, uncertain smile that crossed her face when Ethan's hand brushed hers as he reached for the coffee pot. That afternoon, while Clara and Lucy were collecting eggs, they heard raised voices from the house. Not angry voices, but intense, the sound of people finally saying things that had been left unspoken for too long. Can't keep pretending we're strangers. That was Lydia, her voice carrying through the open window. I'm not pretending. Yes, you are. You're polite and courteous, and you treat me like a guest in a house that's supposed to be my home too. Well, what do you want from me, Lydia? I want you to stop being afraid. I want you to look at me and see someone who's here by choice, not obligation. Her voice broke. I want to matter to you, not as the woman who helped you keep the girls, but as someone you actually want in your life. There was a long silence. Clara held her breath. Then Ethan's voice, raw and honest in a way Clara had never heard before. You do matter. You terrify me because you matter so much. I look at you and I see everything I lost with Sarah, and I know I can't survive losing someone like that again. You won't lose me. You can't promise that. Nobody can. You're right. I can't promise I won't die or get sick or have some accident, but Ethan, I can promise that I won't leave you by choice. I can promise that I'm here because I want to be, not because a judge ordered it or because it's convenient. I gave up everything to be here. Don't you understand? This is where I want to be. You are who I want to be with." Another silence, longer this time. Then a sound Clara couldn't quite identify. Something between a laugh and a sob. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan said, and he sounded lost. "I don't know how to let someone in again." "Then we'll figure it out together." "But Ethan, please, stop pushing me away. Let me be your wife. Your real wife, not just on paper." Clara couldn't hear Ethan's response, but she heard footsteps crossing the floor, and then nothing but silence. She glanced at Lucy, who was watching the house with wide eyes. "Should we go in?" Lucy whispered. "Not yet," Clara said, a smile tugging at her lips. "I think they need a few minutes alone." When they finally went inside an hour later, they found Ethan and Lydia sitting at the kitchen table, their hands clasped together, both looking like they'd been crying. But they were smiling too, tentative and uncertain, but real. "Girls," Lydia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Come here." Clara and Lucy approached cautiously. Ethan pulled out chairs for them, and they sat. "We need to talk to you," Ethan said, "about some changes." Clara's stomach clenched. "What kind of changes?" "Good ones, we hope." Lydia squeezed Ethan's hand. "Ethan and I have been talking, really talking, about what we want this family to look like, and we've decided that we're tired of pretending, tired of performing for the town and the judge and everyone else. We want to be a real family," Ethan continued, "not just for the hearing, but because it's what we all deserve. That means some things are going to be different around here." "Like what?" Lucy asked nervously. Lydia smiled. "Like Lydia and I sharing a room," Ethan said, and Clara saw the faint flush on his cheeks. "Like making decisions together as partners, instead of two people who just happen to live in the same house. Like being honest about what we're building here instead of pretending it's just an arrangement." "We're not doing this because we have to," Lydia added. "We're doing it because we want to, because somewhere along the way this stopped being about saving you girls from the orphanage and started being about building something real. A real home, a real family." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "So you're saying—" "We're saying we choose this," Ethan said firmly. "All of it, the four of us together. Not because a judge says we have to be, but because we want to be." Lucy launched herself at them, wrapping her arms around both Ethan and Lydia at once. Clara followed more slowly, but when she reached them, Ethan pulled her into the embrace too. And for the first time since her mother died, Clara felt completely, utterly safe. They were a family. Not the family any of them had been born into, but the one they'd chosen to create. The weeks before the final hearing passed in a blur of preparation and quiet transformation. Lydia moved her things into Ethan's room, and though Clara didn't ask what happened behind that closed door at night, she noticed how they both seemed lighter, how they touched each other more easily, how Lydia's laugh came more frequently, and Ethan's smiles seemed less forced. The empty bedroom upstairs was transformed into a proper room for Clara and Lucy. Ethan built them a bed frame from pine, and Lydia sewed curtains and quilts. They moved in together, delighted to have space of their own, but already missing the warmth of sleeping by the fire. "You can still sleep down there when it's cold," Ethan assured them. "The room is just for when you want privacy." The ranch itself seemed to reflect the changes happening within its walls. Spring was coming early, the snow beginning to melt and reveal brown grass beneath. The cattle grew restless, sensing the shift in seasons. Ethan started making plans for the coming year, where to plant hay, which fences needed mending, whether to buy more breeding stock. "What do you think?" he asked Lydia one evening, spreading his sketches across the kitchen table. "Should we expand the herd or focus on improving what we have?" Lydia studied the drawings with serious attention. "What about starting small with some chickens for sale? I could manage a larger flock, and fresh eggs sell well in town." "That's good thinking." Ethan made a note on his sketch. "We could build a second coop behind the barn." Clara watched them plan together, their heads bent close over the papers, and felt a swell of pride. This was what a real partnership looked like. Not one person making all the decisions while the other followed, but two people building something together. Mrs. Henderson and her friends visited twice more before the hearing, bringing with them stories and observations they'd share with the judge. They'd witnessed Ethan and Lydia at the general store, working together to choose supplies for the ranch. They'd seen them at church, sitting close together with the girls between them, singing hymns like any other family. They'd observed the small intimacies that couldn't be faked. The way Lydia's hand would rest on Ethan's shoulder as she passed, the way Ethan's eyes sought her out in a crowd, the way they moved together with the easy coordination of people who knew each other well. "Preston's going to fight hard," Mrs. Henderson warned. "He's got his own witnesses lined up, people who'll claim the marriage is still a sham." "Let them," Ethan said quietly. "We know the truth. That's what matters." But as the hearing date drew closer, Clara could see the tension building in both Ethan and Lydia. This wasn't just about keeping Clara and Lucy anymore. It was about defending the life they'd all built together, the family they'd become. The night before the hearing, none of them could sleep. They sat together by the fire, all four of them crowded onto the furniture meant for one family in a way that would have seemed impossible 4 months ago. "What do you think will happen tomorrow?" Lucy asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "I think we'll tell the truth," Lydia said, "and trust that it's enough." "What if it's not?" Lucy's voice was small. "What if the judge doesn't believe us?" Ethan pulled her close. "Then we'll deal with it, together. But Lucy, I need you to understand something. No matter what that judge says tomorrow, you're my daughter, both of you. A piece of paper might say otherwise, but that doesn't change what's true. And I'm your mother now," Lydia added softly. "Maybe not the one who gave birth to you, but the one who chose you. That counts for something." Clara leaned against Lydia's shoulder, feeling the warmth and solidity of her. "It counts for everything." They stayed there until the fire burned low, taking comfort in each other's presence, gathering strength for whatever tomorrow might bring. The courthouse was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed half the town had come to watch the proceedings, some out of genuine concern, others for the spectacle. Clara saw Mrs. Simmons and her society members clustered on one side, their faces smug with certainty. On the other side sat Mrs. Henderson and her friends, along with a surprising number of other townspeople Clara recognized from church and the general store. Judge Morrison called the hearing to order and reviewed the question before him: whether the marriage between Ethan Carter and Lydia Rowan Carter was entered into in good faith, or whether it was a fraudulent arrangement designed solely to circumvent custody laws. Preston presented his case first, calling Mrs. Simmons to testify. "In my observation," she said primly, "Mr. and Mrs. Carter maintain an arrangement that is purely transactional. They married solely to prevent the removal of those children, and while they may have become skilled at performing affection in public, it's clear to anyone with discernment that there is no genuine marital bond between them." "And what evidence do you have for this assertion?" the judge asked. "They maintain separate bedrooms, or at least they did initially. Their interactions are stilted and rehearsed. The marriage occurred with unseemly haste, with no courtship period whatsoever." Mrs. Simmons' voice dripped with disapproval. "It's quite obvious they're simply playing roles." Preston called 2 more witnesses who echoed similar sentiments, though their observations seemed increasingly based on assumption rather than actual evidence. Then it was time for Ethan and Lydia's defense. Mrs. Henderson took the stand first, her testimony calm and matter-of-fact. She described the changes she'd observed in Ethan over the past months, how he'd begun engaging with the community again, how his entire demeanor had softened. She spoke about Lydia's courage in standing up to her father and the genuine care she'd shown the girls. "I've been married for 35 years, Mrs. Henderson said. "I know what a real marriage looks like. And what I've observed between Mr. and Mrs. Carter is real. Maybe it started differently than most, but love doesn't always follow the same path. What matters is where they've arrived." Mrs. Patterson testified next, describing a conversation she'd had with Lydia at the general store. "I asked her if she was happy," Mrs. Patterson said, "and she told me she'd never expected to be, that she'd gone into the marriage as a practical arrangement. But then she smiled, this real, genuine smile, and said that somewhere along the way, it had stopped being an arrangement and started being a choice. That's not something someone says when they're pretending." 3 more witnesses spoke on their behalf, each adding small observations and moments that painted a picture of a family genuinely forming, not just performing. Finally, Judge Morrison called Ethan and Lydia to testify. They stood together, Lydia's hand in Ethan's, and Clara held her breath. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, "when you married Mrs. Carter, what was your intention?" Ethan took a breath. My intention was to keep 2 children from being sent to a place where they'd likely die. That was my only thought at the time. Preston's face lit up with triumph, but the judge held up a hand. And now? What is your intention now? Ethan looked at Lydia, and Clara saw something pass between them. Understanding, affection, trust. Now my intention is to build a life with my wife and children, to be the husband and father they deserve, to create a home that's filled with something other than grief and silence. His voice roughened. I spent 5 years locked away from the world after my first family died. I told myself I'd never risk that kind of pain again. Then Lydia walked into my life, this brave, impossible woman who gave up everything to help 2 children she barely knew. And she taught me that sometimes the risk is worth it. That love isn't just about loss, it's about choice. And I choose her. Every day I choose her. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Mrs. Carter, the judge said gently, you gave up a great deal to enter this marriage. Your home, your relationship with your father, your position in society. Why? Lydia's voice was steady despite her tears. Because I was tired of living a half-life, following someone else's rules about what was proper and respectable. Because I saw 2 little girls who needed a home and a man who'd forgotten how to hope. And I thought maybe I could help. And because, she squeezed Ethan's hand, because I've learned that family isn't just something you're born into. It's something you build, piece by piece, choice by choice. Ethan and I, we built this family. We chose each other. We chose Clara and Lucy. And I would make the same choice again every single day. The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Then he turned to Clara and Lucy. Girls, approach the bench. They walked forward on shaky legs. Clara felt Ethan and Lydia's presence behind her like a warm wall of support. I'm going to ask you a simple question, Judge Morrison said, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If I were to rule that this marriage is fraudulent and order you to be placed elsewhere, how would you feel? Clara looked at Lucy, then back at the judge. I'd feel like you were tearing apart my family, Your Honor, because that's what they are. Ethan and Lydia aren't just people who took us in. They're our parents. They chose us when nobody else wanted us, and we chose them back. If you separate us, you'd be punishing all of us for finding each other. And you, Lucy? Lucy's voice was small but fierce. I'd be sad. Really, really sad, because I love them. The simple honesty of it seemed to echo through the courtroom. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, then gestured for them to return to their seats. I've heard testimony from both sides, he said. I've listened to assertions about propriety and appearances, about proper procedure and suitable arrangements. But I've also heard something else. I've heard testimony about choice, about people who found each other in desperate circumstances and chose to become a family. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the courtroom. The law asks me to determine whether this marriage is genuine, whether it was entered into in good faith. And I find myself asking, what makes a marriage genuine? Is it the ceremony, the paperwork, the blessing of society? He shook his head. No, a marriage is genuine when 2 people commit themselves to each other and to the life they're building together. When they choose partnership over isolation, hope over fear. Preston started to rise, but the judge silenced him with a look. I've observed Mr. and Mrs. Carter throughout these proceedings. I've seen how they look at each other, how they stand together, how they speak about their life and their children. And I've seen those children, healthy, articulate, clearly loved and well cared for. Judge Morrison's voice grew firmer. The petitioners claim this marriage is fraudulent, but I see no fraud here. I see a family that formed in unconventional circumstances, but has proven itself to be as real and valid as any I've encountered. Clara's heart began to pound with hope. Therefore, I rule that the marriage between Ethan James Carter and Lydia Elizabeth Carter is valid and binding. Furthermore, I find that Clara and Lucy Hale are being properly cared for in the Carter household, and that there is no cause for their removal. He looked directly at Preston. The petition to annul the marriage is denied. The petition for custody of the Hale children is denied. This family will remain intact. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Then Mrs. Henderson let out a whoop of joy, and the room erupted into applause and shouts, some celebrating, some protesting, but the celebrating was louder. Clara felt Lucy grab her in a fierce hug. Then Ethan's arms were around them both, and Lydia's, and they stood there in the middle of the courthouse holding each other while everything they'd fought for was finally, truly, theirs. Preston stormed out, his face purple with rage. Mrs. Simmons and her friends followed, their disapproval written in every rigid line of their bodies. But Clara didn't care. Let them leave, let them judge, it didn't matter anymore. They'd won. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Henderson embraced them all, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I knew it," she kept saying. "I knew that judge would see sense." Other townspeople approached with congratulations, some genuine, some grudging, but acknowledgement nonetheless. The Carters were a legitimate family now, recognized not just by their own hearts but by the law itself. The ride home was different from every other ride they'd taken from town. This time, there was no tension, no fear of what tomorrow might bring. Just four people heading home together, knowing that home was exactly where they belonged. When they reached the ranch, Ethan helped Lydia down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her immediately, he pulled her close and kissed her, not for show, not for an audience, but because he wanted to. Lydia melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Clara saw the last of Ethan's walls finally crumble. "Thank you," he whispered against Lydia's hair, "for not giving up on us." "Thank you for letting me in," Lydia whispered back. That evening, they celebrated with a special supper. Nothing fancy, just the best of what they had, prepared with care and eaten with joy. Afterward, they sat around the fire, and Ethan pulled out the wooden horse he'd carved for Emma all those years ago. "I've been thinking," he said, turning the small figure over in his hands. "This belonged to my daughter, my first daughter. And I think it's time it belonged to my daughters now." He handed it to Lucy. "If you want it." But Lucy took it reverently, her eyes wide. "Really? Really? Emma would have liked you, I think, would have liked both of you, and she'd want her things to be used and loved, not locked away gathering dust." Lucy clutched the horse to her chest, then carefully set it on the mantel above the fireplace, a place of honor where everyone could see it. Lydia stood and crossed to the storage room, returning with the trunk that had held her mother's belongings. From it, she pulled a delicate quilt, hand-stitched in shades of blue and white. "My mother made this," she said softly. "She finished it 2 weeks before she died. My father wanted me to pack it away, said it would only remind me of sad things. But I think she'd want it to be used, to keep someone warm." She draped it over Clara's shoulders. "It's yours now, to remember that you come from a line of strong women and you're becoming one yourself." Clara wrapped the quilt around herself, feeling the love and labor that had gone into every stitch. "Thank you," she whispered. "We're all bringing pieces of our past into this family," Ethan said, looking around at all of them. "The good and the hard, the joy and the grief, and somehow it all fits together into something new." "Something better," Lydia added, settling beside him. They sat together as the fire burned low, this family built from loss and choice and stubborn determination. Outside, spring continued its slow arrival, melting the last of winter's snow and revealing the possibility of new growth beneath. The weeks turned into months, and the ranch thrived under the care of 4 people working in harmony. Lydia's chicken flock grew, providing eggs for the family and for sale in town. Clara learned to ride and helped Ethan move cattle to new pasture. Lucy tended her own small garden, growing vegetables that supplemented their meals. And Ethan and Lydia navigated the complex dance of building a real marriage from the foundation of their arranged one, learning each other's habits and preferences, discovering how to fight fair and make up better, growing into partners in every sense of the word. On a Sunday in late summer, they returned from church to find a letter waiting on the doorstep. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, and the return address was from the territorial office. Ethan opened it with shaking hands. Lydia and the girls crowded close to read over his shoulder. It was official documentation, adoption papers, fully executed and stamped with the territorial seal. Clara Hale and Lucy Hale were now, legally and permanently, Clara Carter and Lucy Carter. "I didn't..." Lydia looked at Ethan in wonder. "When did you file these?" "Right after the hearing. I figured if the judge ruled in our favor, there was no reason not to make it official. Make them ours in every way that matters." Ethan looked at Clara and Lucy, his eyes bright. "If you want to be, that is." Clara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded and launched herself at Ethan, Lucy right behind her. They clung to him, to Lydia, to each other, the Carter family, complete and whole and theirs. That night, Clara stood at her bedroom window and looked out over the ranch, the barn where she and Lucy had first hidden, freezing and desperate. The house that had seemed so cold and unwelcoming those first days, but now glowed with lamplight and warmth. The prairie stretching away in all directions, no longer a frozen wasteland, but a sea of grass moving in the summer breeze. She thought about her mother, buried somewhere out there in the frozen ground they'd never been able to properly dig. She hoped her mother would be proud of how they'd survived, how they'd found a new family when the old one was taken away. "Clara?" Lucy appeared beside her, the wooden horse clutched in one hand. "Are you sad?" "No," Clara said, and meant it. "I'm just remembering where we came from, how far we've traveled." "Do you miss Mama?" "Every day. But Lou, I think she'd be happy for us. I think she'd like Lydia and Ethan." "Me too." Lucy leaned against her sister. "We're really going to stay here forever, aren't we?" "Yeah," Clara said softly. "We really are." From downstairs came the sound of Lydia's laugh, followed by Ethan's lower voice saying something that made her laugh again. Normal sounds, family sounds, the sounds of home. Clara pulled Lucy close and looked out at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. She thought about cold and hunger, about loss and fear, about a desperate walk across frozen prairie toward a ribbon of smoke that promised warmth, about finding shelter in a barn and a stranger who'd chosen kindness over convenience. She thought about choice, how Ethan had chosen to help them, how Lydia had chosen to sacrifice everything, how they'd all chosen each other again and again until choice became love and love became family. Outside, snow would come again when winter returned. The prairie would freeze and the wind would howl, and survival would once more require strength and determination. But this time, when the cold came, they'd face it together. This time, they had a home that was truly theirs, not just walls and a roof, but something built from courage and sacrifice, and the stubborn belief that family wasn't about blood or law, but about the people you chose to fight for, to hope with, to love. Clara turned away from the window and headed downstairs, where Lydia was making hot cider and Ethan was stoking the fire, where Lucy would curl up with her wooden horse and drift asleep to the sound of her family's voices, where Clara herself belonged, completely and utterly, without question or doubt. The house was warm, and it would stay that way, she knew, long after winter came and went, because the warmth didn't come from the fire or the walls or even the food and shelter. It came from the 4 people who'd chosen to make this place a home, and that was a warmth that would last forever.